Hey guys, tonight we unravel a story so bewilderingly calm, so laughably polite, and so soaked in historical oversight that it might actually be the coziest war in world history. No screams, no cannonballs, no broken treaties, just a declaration of war that nobody followed up on for 42 years. This strange tale begins not with a dramatic battlefield or a whisper of betrayal, but with salty sea winds, the stubborn pride of 17th-century naval powers, and a little island cluster off the coast of England that no one, not even the people living there, knew was at war. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. We're building a little sleepy international community here, one oddly specific historical anecdote at a time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts, fittingly, in fog. The Isles of Scilly, a small, misty archipelago just off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, England, are the sort of place where the idea of a war sounds more like an exaggeration used to scare away overly ambitious seagulls. These islands are lovely and quiet, even by today's standards, and back in the 1600s, they were practically a secret. But somehow, despite their quiet charm, the Isles of Scilly found themselves on the receiving end of an official declaration of war by the Dutch Republic in 1651. Yes, the actual Dutch. With fleets. You walk the cobbled paths of St. Mary's, the largest island in the Scilly group, and all seems tranquil. You can almost hear the wind teasing tufts of grass along the clifftops, the waves sighing as they hit age-old rocks, and the distant clink of glass from a cozy pub. If you squint, you can imagine a few 17th-century locals scratching their heads as a distant Dutch ship sails past, unfurling a flag that's supposed to strike fear into the hearts of enemies, but instead causes mild confusion about whether it's laundry day. This was no great war with fanfare and pageantry. It was barely a disagreement. More of a bureaucratic performance. Imagine if someone challenged you to a duel, wrote it down formally in calligraphy, then immediately walked off and forgot it ever happened. That's the energy of this entire conflict. And the best part? It wasn't even noticed until over 3 centuries later, when someone was rummaging through old papers and exclaimed, "Wait a second, we never ended this thing." But let's rewind. To understand how we got here, you need to drift back to the middle of the 17th century, a time when Europe was particularly chaotic, even by its own dramatic standards. The Dutch Republic was a major maritime power, constantly in and out of wars with Spain, England, and basically anyone who dared look at them sideways near a trade route. And England? Oh, England was having one of its classic identity crises. King Charles I had just lost his head, literally, in 1649, leading to a war between royalists, loyal to the dead king's cause, and parliamentarians, fans of democracy, or at least a really strict parliament. Enter the Isles of Scilly. Tiny. Isolated. Loyal to the royalist cause, because apparently, even small islands like to have big opinions. This choice would come back to mildly inconvenience them a few years later. As you hear the splash of waves and feel the imaginary sea spray on your face, picture this: the Dutch, allied with the parliamentarians in England, get irritated that Scilly is harboring royalist privateers, essentially pirates with better manners and official licenses. Dutch ships had been attacked by these sea bandits, so they decided enough was enough. In a move that was more performative than practical, Admiral Martin Tromp sailed to the Isles of Scilly in 1651, issued a declaration of war, and then promptly did nothing. No cannons were fired. No islands were stormed. No angry letters followed. He just left. Like a ghosting ex with naval credentials. And here's where things get delightfully absurd. Since Scilly wasn't an independent nation, just a quirky outpost technically under English rule, the declaration of war was already kind of shaky. Once the royalists lost the Civil War and the parliamentarians took over all of England again, the issue of Scilly became even more of a meh. But no one remembered to cancel the war. Tromp either didn't file the paperwork or didn't care. Back in the Netherlands, no one updated the scrolls. And in Scilly, life went on. For centuries. With no one realizing that, on paper, they were still enemies with the Dutch Republic. Mainstream historians love to argue about major wars, the causes, the effects, the strategies. But here, they're left scratching their heads. Was this a real war? Does it count if no one fights? Can you even have a war if one side doesn't know about it? The scholarly debate around this war is its own kind of slow-burn comedy. Some say it was a war in name only, a symbolic gesture meant to pressure the royalists. Others argue that because the Dutch had official declarations and logs, it must count, even if the practical aspect of the war was non-existent. And still others claim the whole thing was a diplomatic error, a misfire of intentions that lasted longer than the average human lifespan. One quirky fact lost in footnotes: the Isles of Scilly, even today, have more sheep than permanent residents, and locals often joke that if the Dutch had invaded, they would have been met with sleepy stares and maybe a strongly worded note from the village bakery. It's as if history itself forgot to proofread this part of the timeline. As you lie there listening to this absurd beginning, think of the centuries rolling by. Of children growing up on Scilly unaware they were at war. Of Dutch officials sipping coffee in The Hague, oblivious to the fact that their country was technically still engaged in a long-forgotten naval grudge. No shots. No casualties. Not even a sternly shaken fist across the sea. Just a declaration that lingered like the smell of an old candle, faint, peculiar, and entirely unnecessary. And yet, this ghost of a war persisted. It lived in silence, buried beneath more important conflicts, until someone decided to dig it up and ask, should we, maybe end this? That question, and the hilariously gentle conclusion it led to, is what we'll drift toward next. For now, though, let the waves of this forgotten conflict lull you into the sweet absurdity of a world where wars can start without a single soul noticing. The Isles of Scilly don't just sound like something invented by a half-sleeping mapmaker, they actually sort of feel like that, too. As you close your eyes and picture the coast of Cornwall, imagine the land tapering off into craggy cliffs and salty wind, until it gives way to scattered rocks in the sea that somehow got their own postal code. These are the Isles of Scilly, technically part of the United Kingdom, but separated from the mainland by about 28 miles of choppy water and about 300 years of people forgetting they exist. You hear seabirds calling from the cliffs, waves crashing against granite, and maybe, just maybe, the faint sound of someone asking, wait, we're at war with who? What makes the Scilly Isles so delightfully strange is that their very existence seems like a gentle prank. They're small. So small, in fact, that if you sneezed while looking at a map of England, you might miss them entirely. And yet, they've played host to prehistoric settlements, medieval legends, Viking visits, and even the occasional wartime oopsie, like the one we're currently exploring. The Scilly Isles are made up of over 140 islands, but only 5 are inhabited: St. Mary's, Tresco, St. Martin's, Briar, and St. Agnes. The rest are like lost jigsaw pieces scattered in the ocean. Some are little more than rocks, while others feature ruins, wildflowers, and puffins living better lives than most of us. For centuries, the Scillies were seen as remote, stormy, and strategically irrelevant, unless, of course, you were a pirate, a smuggler, or a 17th-century naval commander with a point to prove. That's how they ended up in the middle of a 42-year war with the Dutch Republic. The problem? Even in 1651, when the war was technically declared, no one could seem to agree on whether the Isles were really there. Some maps showed them. Others didn't. Some called them part of Cornwall. Others treated them like a sovereign zone run by sheep. One popular theory is that Dutch sailors, unfamiliar with the political messiness of England's post-Civil War chaos, assumed Scilly was a kind of rogue nation under royalist control. And that assumption, more than anything else, may have been enough to trigger a formal declaration of war. You hear the wind shift now, a low moaning sound through old stone walls and crooked wooden signs. It's easy to imagine the life of an islander in the 1600s, waking up to gulls, checking lobster traps, trading gossip at the alehouse, and having no clue you're supposedly in a state of war with a country across the North Sea. One quirky fact that historians love to point out is that during this time, the Scillies were used by royalists as a kind of naval hideaway. Privateers, basically legal pirates, would base themselves there and harass Dutch merchant ships. The Dutch, understandably, were not amused. They were in the middle of their own war with Spain and didn't appreciate being randomly dragged into someone else's soap opera. But here's the thing, even the Dutch weren't entirely sure what Scilly was. Was it part of England? Was it its own thing? Was it even important? Admiral Martin Tromp, who declared war in 1651, probably made the decision while squinting at an outdated sea chart and muttering, "This'll show them." And yet, he never actually attacked. That's right, he declared war, and then did absolutely nothing. No invasion. No blockade. No warning shots. It was like writing an angry letter, sealing it in a bottle, and throwing it into a lake without telling anyone. This leads to an open scholarly debate: did the Dutch truly consider this a legitimate war, or was it a diplomatic signal meant to rattle sabers without actually using them? Some argue that Tromp's declaration was symbolic, an act of pressure on the royalists. Others claim that since the Scillies weren't technically a nation, the declaration was never valid to begin with. And then there's a fringe school of thought that suggests the whole thing might have been exaggerated later, retroactively labeled a war, by overenthusiastic historians and trivia lovers. After all, it's awfully convenient to have a war that didn't require food rations, troop movements, or actual participation. You lay there, cozy, listening to the swirl of debate echoing through academic journals and quiet village libraries. No one can seem to agree on what Scilly was in 1651, and that confusion may be the very reason this non-war dragged on for over 4 decades. But what the Scillys lacked in strategic importance, they made up for in personality. Even back then, the islands had a reputation for being charmingly chaotic. There was no real central government, and most decisions were made by a mix of tradition, rumor, and who happened to own the most goats. Maritime law barely applied, and the concept of declaring war on such a place would have sounded like declaring war on your neighbor's backyard garden. Still, geography is a powerful thing. Sitting where they did, the Scillys were just close enough to the English mainland to matter in theory, but just far enough away to be neglected in practice. That ambiguity made them a perfect scapegoat. The Dutch needed a target to justify their frustrations with royalist attacks, and Scilly, with its half-known status and blurry maps, fit the bill. As you imagine the islands in fog, the waves curling against quiet beaches, and ancient stone cottages dotting the cliffs, it's not hard to see why no one followed up on Tromp's declaration. The place felt more like a dream than a threat. And yet, from 1651 onward, the Scillys were, technically, at war. Not that anyone told the residents. They went about their lives in blissful ignorance, raising sheep, collecting driftwood, and occasionally fending off storms with rope and prayer. Dutch sailors, for their part, probably forgot all about the incident as soon as they returned to the mainland. Life went on. The world moved forward. And the war was forgotten. Not ended. Not resolved. Just left there. A forgotten bookmark in the pages of European conflict. And so, we're left with a tiny corner of the world that became a war zone in name only, a strange footnote in history, and one that nobody noticed for over 300 years. How do you lose a war that nobody fought? And how do you even notice when something that small, that quiet, has technically been unresolved for centuries? We'll wander a bit further into that mystery next. But for now, just enjoy the idea that somewhere out there, a war once happened not with a bang, but with the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. Let's ease deeper into the cloudy soup of the 17th century, that delightful era when everyone in Europe was declaring wars the way we now declare unread emails, far too often and with very little follow-through. Tonight, you're reclining in the gently swaying shadows of a Dutch merchant ship circa 1650, bobbing in a cold sea under a sky that can't decide whether it wants to storm or sparkle. You can smell the heavy salt air, damp rope, and distant musk of overworked sailors. Your fingers trail the ridged grain of wooden railings, worn smooth by decades of trading goods, dodging pirates, and, lately, wondering why there are suddenly more enemies than allies. Because here's the thing, by the mid-1600s, the Dutch Republic was tired. Bone-tired. Imagine a country held together by planks, willpower, and increasingly petty paperwork. The Dutch were wealthy and powerful thanks to maritime trade, but they were also stretched thinner than a windmill's shadow at dusk. Their golden age was a time of stunning art, science, and commerce, but also one of constant geopolitical headaches. And headaches, like this mysterious little war with the Isles of Scilly, had a way of appearing when you least had the energy for them. So, why were the Dutch so perpetually peeved? Because they were essentially running a startup empire in a world of lumbering monarchies. They'd only officially declared independence from Spain in 1581, by 1648, that war finally ended, with the Dutch gritting their teeth and filing a thick treaty with all the relief of someone finishing a 1,000-page tax audit. But just when they thought peace might finally break out, England imploded into civil war, and the delicate balance of alliances they relied on began to wobble like a tipsy stork. The Dutch were not only wary of the Spanish and the Portuguese, they now had to deal with unpredictable English factions, all of whom kept switching allegiances and naval policies like they were changing wigs. And the seas, the Dutch Republic's pride and profit, had become suspiciously full of privateers. These were pirates with a legal excuse, sometimes flying the English flag, other times just flying at all. Their favorite targets? Dutch merchant ships carrying spices, silks, and other valuables across the Atlantic and around Africa. You, sitting on the deck of a Dutch flight ship, hear the frustrated mutters of sailors who have just narrowly avoided another ambush. These are men who've survived storms, illness, and angry sea gulls, only to be robbed by English sympathizers hiding in places like the Isles of Scilly. The annoyance was real. The paperwork was increasing. And Admiral Martin Tromp, yes, him again, was getting more and more letters from the government demanding something be done. Tromp himself is an interesting character. A career naval commander, gruff and well-respected, he had the kind of name you'd expect from someone who solved problems by pointing at a map and sending ships. In 1651, he was tasked with protecting Dutch trade routes and discouraging further attacks from royalist-backed vessels. That's how he found himself peering through a foggy spyglass at the Isles of Scilly, annoyed, underfunded, and ready to make a symbolic gesture that would go down in history, just not in the way anyone expected. Now, to be fair, the Dutch had good reason to suspect something shady was going on in Scilly. Intelligence reports, which in the 1600s meant a guy who talked to another guy who saw something near a dock, claimed that English royalists were harboring privateers there. These men were attacking Dutch ships, stealing cargo, and vanishing into the fog. Since the Scillies were under royalist control at the time, and since the parliamentarians didn't seem interested in stopping them, the Dutch concluded, reasonably, that Scilly was a threat. But instead of launching an invasion, Tromp declared war. Why no invasion? Historians aren't sure. Maybe he lacked the resources. Maybe he thought the declaration itself would scare the royalists off. Or maybe, as one fringe theory suggests, Tromp intended the declaration as a bluff, a message not to Scilly, but to England: get your house in order. The academic debate still flickers quietly among history circles like a candle in a dusty study. Was Tromp acting with full authority? Was the Dutch government truly invested in this conflict? Did they ever notify Parliament that they declared war on a corner of England? Mainstream historians generally agree that the declaration was technically real, but almost entirely ignored by both sides. No ships were redirected. No reinforcements arrived. And within months, the English Civil War ended, the Royalists surrendered, and the strategic importance of Scilly evaporated like mist on the sea. But no one told the Dutch Republic to cancel the war. And so, like an overdue library book that nobody noticed was missing, the war sat, officially undeclared, entirely inactive, but still on record. That brings us to one of the quirkiest details in this entire story: the war's total body count. 0. No casualties. No wounded. Not even a sprained ankle or a paper cut from a naval memo. It is, to this day, one of the only known wars in European history with absolutely no violence. One fact that always gets left out of the textbooks: the Dutch Republic was so good at record-keeping in their golden age that some archivists today still study 17th-century ledgers just to marvel at the handwriting. But for all their bureaucratic skill, no one seems to have properly documented the cancellation of the Scilly conflict. Which is funny, because they documented everything else. Trade contracts. Diplomatic overtures. Even the cost of a decent herring sandwich in 1649. And yet, no one filed the memo that said, oh, by the way, we're no longer at war with that one sheep-filled island cluster. As you listen to the creak of sails and imagine the cool sea breeze brushing your face, you can almost hear the quiet tick of forgotten diplomacy. The Dutch, with their ledgers and trade fleets, moved on. England moved on. Scilly went back to being a charming nowhere in the Atlantic. And the war just lingered. Like a typo on a monument or a ghost ship on a calm sea. The scholarly takeaway here is surprisingly relevant even now: sometimes the biggest consequences come not from action, but from inaction. No one ended the war, so the war didn't end. Not loudly. Not even quietly. Just indefinitely. And that idea, the persistence of paper wars, will drift with us into the next part of the journey, where we'll explore how England's own internal meltdown made all this so much weirder. But for now, let yourself smile at the idea that an entire country, in its golden age of trade and triumph, declared war on some foggy rocks, and then forgot. The moment you step into the English mid-1600s, it's like walking into a poorly managed tavern brawl that somehow got classified as a national event. Picture it: you wander through muddy cobblestone streets, the smell of smoke and old beer lingering in the air, while neighbors glare suspiciously at each other because one supports the king and the other prefers Parliament. Everything is tense, unpredictable, and vaguely damp. In this backdrop of political chaos, the tiny Isles of Scilly, those foggy, wave-washed bits of land floating off Cornwall, somehow get caught in the gravitational pull of a much bigger, weirder conflict. The English Civil War, which officially began in 1642 and wrapped up, mostly, by 1651, wasn't your typical clash of armies and borders. No, this was England fighting with itself like a nation having a very public mental breakdown. On one side, the Royalists, who supported King Charles I, divine right of kings, and stylish velvet capes. On the other, the parliamentarians, who were tired of the monarchy's spending habits and wanted more say in government affairs, taxes, and, frankly, who got to control the army. You, walking through the thick political fog of the era, hear sermons in town squares, angry pamphlets fluttering from windows, and the thud of boots as militias march without always knowing why. The war was fought in towns, villages, fields, and occasionally in the awkward silences of aristocratic dinner parties. What makes it all so important for our story is that while the rest of England was bickering, battling, and beheading kings, yes, they really did that in 1649, the Isles of Scilly ended up picking a side, sort of. You see, the islands had long been under the control of the Godolphin family, staunch royalist supporters. When things got spicy, the royalists needed a base far away from the increasingly parliament-friendly cities. And so, the Scillys became a sort of emergency storage closet for the royalist cause. Royalist privateers, those charmingly violent quasi-pirates with letters of marque, were allowed to operate from Scilly's hidden coves and misty harbors. Their job? Disrupt Dutch shipping and harass anyone who looked vaguely parliamentarian. And yes, the Dutch were allied with the parliamentarians at this point, because even in civil wars, international politics can't resist poking their nose in. Here's where it gets messy. The Dutch, watching their merchant ships disappear into the fog thanks to these pesky royalist pirates, had to decide what to do. And this is when they spotted Scilly, isolated, royalist, and apparently full of ships that liked to rob Dutch cargo. From their perspective, declaring war made sense. Or at least it made sense in the kind of 1600s logic that also believed you could cure illness with leeches and astrology. You can almost hear the meeting in The Hague: we must protect our merchants. Let us declare war on these mysterious British rocks we just heard about yesterday. One mainstream historical fact that adds flavor here is that Admiral Martin Tromp, the man who eventually declared war on Scilly, was already engaged in naval battles around the British Isles. In 1651, he led fleets that supported parliamentarian forces and secured shipping lanes. Declaring war on a royalist hideout like Scilly wasn't just a prank, it was strategy, or at least a symbolic show of strength. But here's where the Civil War chaos really kicks in. The moment Tromp declared war in April 1651, the political landscape in England was shifting faster than anyone could keep up with. The parliamentarians were already gaining the upper hand. That very same year, Charles II, son of the freshly beheaded Charles I, was defeated at the Battle of Worcester, effectively ending major royalist resistance. The royalist stronghold on Scilly? It collapsed shortly after. And with that, the war's rationale vanished like mist at sunrise. The privateers packed up. The Dutch fleet sailed off. England's internal fighting mostly ended. But, and this is the fringe detail you'll love, no one ever told the Dutch government that the war they started with Scilly no longer mattered. In the fog of war, both literal and metaphorical, the whole issue just got skipped. Lost. Forgotten. Misfiled in a drawer next to list of diplomatic things we'll handle eventually. You're left with the image of two countries, well, a country and a foggy island group, technically at war, even though one had already lost the Civil War and the other had gone back to haggling over tulip prices. One open scholarly debate that trickles out of this moment is whether the Dutch war declaration even held legal weight once the parliamentarians retook control of the Isles. Think about it, Tromp declared war on the royalist-controlled Scillys. But once Parliament took the island back, did that war automatically transfer? Or did it just become a conflict with a group that no longer existed? Some legal historians argue that because the governing power of Scilly changed, the war became void. Others say that unless the Dutch sent a formal declaration to the new rulers, which they didn't, the war technically remained active. It's a diplomatic shrug that no one ever followed up on. Quirky fact for your bedtime trivia bank: during the English Civil War, people were so suspicious of one another that even cheese markets were occasionally used for spying. That's right, spies would eavesdrop under the guise of selling wheels of cheddar. And meanwhile, in the far-off Scillys, sheep and sailors were unknowingly representing a government that had just collapsed. As you drift into a quieter mental space, imagine the Isles during this bizarre interlude. The royalists surrender. Parliament takes over. Life continues. The pubs reopen. Fishing resumes. And absolutely no one thinks to ask, hey, remember that fleet of Dutch ships from a few months ago? Are we still at war with them? The question never gets asked. And because it never gets asked, it never gets answered. Which is how, through a unique alignment of Civil War confusion, naval politics, and administrative neglect, a war that barely even started was allowed to linger quietly for 42 years. Not a single cannon fired. Not a musket loaded. Just a ghost of a conflict, trapped between chapters in history. And so the Isles of Scilly, sleepy and salt-crusted, drifted into a kind of unofficial peacetime that nobody bothered to make official. You'll see how that quiet forgetfulness becomes even more bizarre as we move forward, because what comes next is 300 years of silence, punctuated only by the occasional historian raising an eyebrow and asking, wait, didn't we forget something? But for now, just enjoy the quiet irony: a war that started during a civil war, ended with no one noticing, and existed mostly because everyone involved was too busy arguing about other things. As you settle further into the story, it's time to adjust your imaginary tricorn hat and squint toward the horizon like a suspicious 17th century sailor. We're now drifting through the part of the war that wasn't, where tensions, while never quite erupting, certainly started bubbling with more enthusiasm. You smell the wood smoke from coastal fires, hear the creak of anchor chains, and feel the sudden presence of watchful eyes on distant sails. Because even though this so-called war never saw a single cannonball fly between Dutch and Solonian forces, it did escalate in a uniquely bureaucratic and piratical way, through privateers, blockades, and a good deal of passive-aggressive sea cruising. First, let's clarify the scene. The Isles of Scilly, by the mid-1600s, had become something of a maritime speakeasy for royalist-aligned privateers. These weren't your peg-legged, eye-patched storybook pirates, well, not always. They were usually hired guns, licensed by the royalist cause to attack enemy merchant ships. The key word here is licensed. A privateer was a legal pirate, more or less, as long as he had papers from a government in exile that had recently lost its monarch and was now based mostly in dreams and country estates. You imagine one of these rugged seamen swaggering into a tiny Solonian harbor tavern, slapping wet coinage on the table and boasting of goods taken from a Dutch merchant ship. In the corner, a goat munches on some leftover parchment. No one seems particularly scandalized. And this is what really annoyed the Dutch. They weren't just mad at the royalists. They were mad that the Scilly Isles, barely a political entity in their own right, were offering quiet approval, or at least warm beer and harbor space, to people interfering with Dutch shipping lanes. From the Dutch point of view, it wasn't just about lost cargo, it was about maintaining maritime dominance. The Dutch Republic's economy was floating on trade, spices from the East Indies, textiles, tobacco, sugar. And here were these rickety royalist ships, harbored in Scilly, biting away at their cargo like barnacles on a hull. So, by 1651, the Dutch had had enough. That's when Admiral Martin Tromp shows up again in this foggy, funny chronicle. You remember Tromp, the man with a name like a baritone trumpet blast and the penchant for bold gestures. This time, his fleet sailed near the Scilly Isles not for diplomacy or trade, but for what we might generously call strategic theater. He arrives with ships. He surveys the island. And then, in what has become the most anticlimactic war declaration in naval history, he officially announces that the Dutch Republic is at war with the Isles of Scilly. Full stop. You half expect him to turn dramatically, shake a fist at the sea, and then, do nothing. Which, oddly, is more or less what happened. Tromp's fleet lingered just offshore. He didn't land troops. He didn't burn the harbor. He didn't even chase down any royalist ships that might have been nearby. Instead, the Dutch naval presence took on the air of a very stern librarian standing near a noisy table, clearly disapproving, but not actually issuing any fines. One mainstream historical fact that makes this even funnier is that the Dutch Navy was, at the time, extremely capable. Tromp had just come off major victories and was commanding one of the most respected fleets in Europe. He could have obliterated Scilly if he wanted to. But he didn't. Why? Historians have offered several theories. One says the Dutch didn't want to antagonize Parliament, their actual ally, by attacking British territory, even if that territory was in royalist hands. Another says Tromp didn't see Scilly as worth the effort. And then there's a third, fringe theory, that Tromp declared war without formal approval from The Hague and quickly realized he couldn't back it up with action. So instead of fighting, he just loitered with intent. You now imagine the scene from the shore. Solonian villagers peer through crude telescopes at the Dutch fleet anchored offshore. Rumors fly, are they going to invade? Is there going to be a sea battle? Should someone alert the cows? And then, nothing happens. Days pass. Maybe weeks. Eventually the Dutch fleet sails away, perhaps having run low on enthusiasm, snacks, or both. But here's the kicker, no one tells anyone else that the war is off. It wasn't even officially acknowledged by Scilly's side, likely because they had no idea it was happening. The only people who knew the war had started were the Dutch fleet, their admirals, and maybe a clerk back in the Netherlands who forgot to file the "cancel war" memo. Still, the presence of Dutch ships in the area was felt. Local fishing routes were disrupted. Trade grew nervous. And even if there were no open battles, the possibility of one hung in the air like sea fog. One quirky fact, a handful of Solonian records from the late 1600s make vague references to foreign ships seen near the coast, possibly referring to this Dutch presence. But nothing specific. It's like the whole episode was half remembered, like a strange dream you're not sure actually happened. And the result of all this floating drama? Absolutely no resolution. No peace treaty. No formal discussion. No notes passed in class. The Dutch ships went home. The Scillys continued to exist. And the war just hung there. Dormant. like a screensaver on a computer no one remembered to turn off. One open scholarly debate around this phase is whether the Dutch blockade, if you can even call it that, constitutes an act of war or simply a show of force. Some argue that the fleet's presence and Tromp's official declaration meet the minimum requirement for legal warfare under 17th-century maritime law. Others claim that without hostile action, it doesn't qualify. The laws back then were vague, but this case remains one of the most frequently cited examples of a phantom war, a conflict that exists more in theory than in practice. As you lie there imagining foggy harbors and fluttering royalist flags, consider this: in a world where most wars involve bloody battles and tragic losses, the silly conflict escalated through stern looks, questionable paperwork, and the occasional pirate. And even that tiny flicker of tension was allowed to fade away without ceremony. It's a reminder that history isn't always written with fire and fury. Sometimes it's scribbled in pencil and then forgotten under a cup of tea. But we're not quite done with the escalation yet. There's still the strange after-effect of this non-conflict, the echo it left in naval records, and the decades of confused silence that followed. That's what we'll unravel next. But for now, sleep easy knowing that the only things truly captured during this war were probably a few unlucky fish and maybe one or two goats that wandered into the wrong campfire. Now imagine you're a clerk in The Hague, quill in hand, coffee going cold, surrounded by towering shelves of maritime logs, war declarations, and trade reports. It's the late 1600s. You've just spent the day filing urgent notices about an upcoming trade mission to Java and a few complaints about herring taxation. You stretch your aching back and glance at a yellowed scroll tucked behind a stack labeled Pending Naval Operations. You blink at the words, Declaration of War, Isles of Scilly, April 1651. You scratch your head, shrug, and slide it back into the stack. That, in essence, was the fate of the so-called war between the Dutch Republic and the Isles of Scilly. It wasn't ended. It wasn't renewed. It wasn't discussed. It was simply buried under centuries of forgetfulness, paperwork, and the unspoken assumption that surely someone else had already handled it. The war became like an unpaid parking ticket lost in the system, technically still active, but functionally meaningless. And the best part? No one noticed. Not the Dutch. Not the British. Certainly not the Solonians, who were probably more concerned with sheep illnesses and boat repairs. You, meanwhile, lying in bed with the hum of a fan or maybe the faint sound of wind rustling outside, now find yourself in a curious historical void. Because from 1651 until 1986, a full 335 years later, this war existed in the background noise of history, never corrected, never resolved. Just awkwardly there. Let's drift for a moment through that vast timeline. The 18th century rolls in, full of powdered wigs, revolutions, and empires rising and falling. Wars break out across Europe and the Americas. The Dutch fight the English in at least 3 more conflicts. The French monarchy collapses. Napoleon happens. Britain colonizes half the map. Industrial revolutions begin. Electricity is harnessed. And through all of it, Scilly is still, technically, at war with the Netherlands. It's like that one group chat from 2010 that no one remembers to leave. You just keep seeing it pop up every few years with a birthday message, and no one has the heart to delete it. The Scilly-Dutch War quietly survived the Enlightenment, the Napoleonic Wars, the unification of Germany, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, 2 world wars, and the invention of the Internet, without a single shot, ship, or shout. And no one said a word. One mainstream historical fact that makes this even funnier: both the UK and the Netherlands signed numerous diplomatic treaties during this period, alliances, trade agreements, peace accords, and cooperation charters. And in not one of them did anyone remember to address the unresolved Scilly situation. It just didn't come up. Not even once. It's as if the war was so small, so utterly irrelevant, that even nations with entire ministries of foreign affairs couldn't be bothered to close the loop. The Dutch, renowned for their meticulous record-keeping, missed it. The British, champions of bureaucracy, missed it. Scilly, which at some point probably just assumed the Dutch didn't like them very much, never knew they had an international situation on their hands. Here's where it gets beautifully quirky. The Dutch Republic didn't even exist by the 1800s. It had become the Batavian Republic, then the Kingdom of Holland, then part of the French Empire, and finally, after much political ping-pong, the modern Netherlands. Through all those changes, the original declaration of war stayed technically active, passed like a tiny baton of paperwork from one government to the next. Think of it like inheriting your great-great-great-grandfather's unpaid bar tab without ever realizing it. One open scholarly debate centers around legal continuity. If the Dutch Republic ceased to exist and became the Kingdom of the Netherlands, does that transfer the war by default? Or did it end legally with the fall of the Republic? Some historians argue that successor states inherit legal responsibilities. Others insist that only active conflicts transfer, and since Scilly never responded, there was no true state of war to pass along. But no one reached a definitive answer. Not because they couldn't, but because no one cared enough to ask. And so the war lived on. Not in battles or strategies, but in silence. Like a ghost in the national attic. One quirky detail that's almost too good to be true: in the 1800s, the Scilly Isles developed a modest tourism economy. Imagine if they had known they were still at war, they could have charged danger zone premiums for visiting the world's most relaxed conflict area. You can picture a Victorian tourist stepping off the boat, parasol in hand, asking, "Why is there a Dutch flag in the museum?" only to be told, "Oh, we've technically been at war since 1651, but it's mostly decorative." So how did this all finally come to light? Not through any government audit. Not through a diplomatic crisis. No, the person who rediscovered the longest forgotten war in history was, of course, a historian. In the 1980s, a local historian named Roy Duncan from Scilly was doing what local historians do: combing through archives, piecing together stories that no one else had bothered to finish. That's when he stumbled across references to the Dutch declaration of war. Curious, he searched for a corresponding peace treaty or formal resolution. None existed. He contacted the Dutch embassy in London. The Dutch, amused and slightly horrified, confirmed there had never been a formal end to the war. One Dutch official even remarked that the matter had simply slipped through the cracks. And so, in 1986, an official delegation from the Netherlands arrived on the Isles of Scilly. There were no weapons. No ships. No soldiers. Just suits, briefcases, and what must have been a very awkward diplomatic speech. The Dutch ambassador and the chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council shook hands and signed a peace treaty, formally ending the war after 335 years. It was witnessed by amused locals, journalists, and at least one seagull that was probably confused about all the attention. One final quirky twist: the Dutch brought champagne. Because, of course, they did. And after signing the treaty, both parties toasted the end of history's most polite, most thoroughly ignored war. You can almost hear the clink of glasses, the soft laughter, and the unspoken realization that sometimes, the smallest historical threads are the most delicious to tug. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, picture the Isles of Scilly, misty, green, forever sleepy, and know that for over 3 centuries, they were at war, and absolutely no one noticed. Next, we'll dig into the personalities involved in the 1986 peace signing and how this sleepy moment became a global curiosity. But for now, let your breath slow and your mind settle in the absurd comfort of a war that was more of a paperwork problem than a battlefield, and the satisfying clink of glasses that finally put it all to rest. It's 1986. Neon tracksuits are in, rotary phones still rule the kitchen wall, and someone somewhere is probably rewinding a VHS tape before bedtime. But on the quiet shores of the Isles of Scilly, a place better known for its seabirds, lighthouses, and comically stubborn sheep, something historic is happening. After 335 years of a war that no one fought, remembered, or even mentioned at dinner parties, 2 sides are finally coming together to end it once and for all. You hear the sea breeze shuffle across low stone walls and smell salt in the air. The weather is typically British, pleasant in a suspicious sort of way, like it might rain just for dramatic effect. You're standing now on the harbour of St. Mary's, the largest of the Scilly Isles, and it feels like a village fair is about to begin. People gather, some holding thermoses of tea, others elbowing for a better view. The Dutch ambassador to the United Kingdom is arriving today, not to scold, negotiate, or issue ultimatums, but to formally end what might be the longest accidental war in European history. He's accompanied by a few cheerful diplomats, briefcases in hand, and one of them, because history does have a sense of humor, has brought along a bottle of champagne. Or 2. You can almost hear someone whisper, "Better late than never." At the heart of this scene stands Roy Duncan, the local historian and Scilly Island Council chairman who first rediscovered the whole mess. Let's talk about Roy for a moment. In a world of blockbuster historians and loud revisionists, Roy was the best kind of local hero, the sort who quietly sifted through old ledgers, town records, and maritime lore in search of overlooked truths. He wasn't looking for glory. He was just curious. While researching the island's royalist past, Roy stumbled across Admiral Martin Tromp's declaration of war from 1651. Then, like any good historian with an itch, he went looking for a peace treaty, and found nothing. That's when Roy did something surprisingly rare in modern history: he picked up the phone. He contacted the Dutch embassy in London and asked the most baffling question they'd received in decades: "Excuse me, but are we still technically at war?" The embassy was, understandably, skeptical. They dug through their own archives. They asked around. And finally, they confirmed what Roy had suspected: no one had ever signed anything to end the war. The war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly had simply never stopped. Just forgotten. You imagine the phone call where a Dutch official, probably surrounded by potted plants and politely labeled folders, mutters, "Huh. Well, that's awkward." And thus began the slow-motion coordination of what would become one of the most charming diplomatic events in history. The Dutch agreed to send an official delegation to the Isles. Not because they were angry, not because they demanded restitution or apology, but because they saw the delightful absurdity of the situation and wanted to close the loop with style. It's worth noting a mainstream historical fact here: the Netherlands, even in the 20th century, took these kinds of symbolic moments seriously. Their diplomatic tradition is steeped in precision, ceremony, and a touch of theatrical charm. So, the delegation arrived dressed like diplomats, spoke like old friends, and brought with them a resolution. The document they signed, officially ending the war declared in 1651, was simple, clear, and entirely free of bureaucratic fluff. Both sides agreed that any hostilities, perceived or otherwise, were over. They shook hands. They smiled for photos. The champagne popped. One quirky detail from that day: a Dutch official later admitted that the embassy staff had to call several older diplomats just to ask, "How do we write a peace treaty for a war no one remembers?" Turns out, there's no manual for that. You picture the room where it happened: a few chairs pulled together in a community hall, a desk brought in from someone's home, the gentle creak of floorboards under the weight of history. The audience included locals, reporters, and probably one or two tourists who had no idea what they'd wandered into. Children tugged at their parents' coats, wondering why everyone was shaking hands over a war they didn't know existed. The Dutch ambassador, in his speech, joked that they were relieved the Salonians hadn't launched a surprise counterattack. Laughter rolled through the crowd like the sea itself, gentle, amused, and grateful for the moment. Then came the toasts. Glasses lifted to peace, to friendship, to the quiet absurdity of history. The champagne, dry and faintly citrusy, bubbled away as everyone sipped and sighed, not because they'd ended a war with consequences, but because they'd closed a door no one remembered leaving open. One open scholarly debate remains about this event, and it's oddly philosophical: was it a real peace treaty, or a ceremonial fiction? Since the original declaration of war came from Admiral Tromp, not an official parliamentary body, and since Scilly was never a sovereign nation, some legal scholars argue that the treaty was symbolic rather than necessary. Others insist that, given the continuity of the Dutch state and the longevity of the conflict, a peace treaty, no matter how informal, was appropriate. What matters more than legality, though, is the tone. No one was angry. No one made demands. The treaty was signed in good faith and good humor, proving that history isn't always a grim procession of violence and vengeance. Sometimes, it's a shaggy dog story with a champagne-soaked punchline. As you listen to the wind pick up outside your own window, picture the Isles of Scilly after the ceremony. The visitors leave. The crowd disperses. Fishermen go back to their boats. Children chase seagulls. And somewhere in the corner of a community center, the official peace treaty sits quietly in a frame, next to photos of smiling diplomats and a nearly forgotten flag. You might expect that this moment would fade into obscurity again. But it didn't. The story went viral, in a pre-internet kind of way. Newspapers picked it up. Late-night talk shows joked about it. History magazines ran articles with headlines like, "World's Longest War Ends in a Toast." It became a legend not just because it was funny, but because it felt healing. In a world that's often too quick to fight and too slow to forgive, this small act of diplomatic whimsy felt like a deep breath, a reminder that sometimes, forgotten problems can be solved with a smile, a pen, and a glass of something fizzy. So tonight, as you drift closer to sleep, think of Roy Duncan, historian, peacemaker, and perhaps the only man in modern history to end a war with a polite phone call. Think of the champagne, the laughter, the sunny harbor, and the centuries of silence broken only by a few curious pages in an old archive. And know that in the end, some of the best stories in history are the ones where absolutely nothing terrible happens. You awaken on a misty morning in the Isles of Scilly, only to realize you've time-traveled, well, mentally, at least, to an archipelago that has quietly existed for centuries with one of the most delightfully low-stress geopolitical records imaginable. Today we settle into the islanders' perspective, because let's face it, if you were told your tiny community had technically been at war with the Netherlands for over 3 centuries without your knowledge, wouldn't you at least raise one bemused eyebrow? Let's pull back the curtain. The Isles of Scilly, nestled about 28 miles off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, are a cluster of subtropical-ish gems known for their gentle landscapes, flour exports, and a rhythm of life that prioritizes tea over tension. Even in the 1600s, when the original war was declared, the population was small, rural, scattered, and more concerned with fishing and surviving rough seas than with international disputes. So when Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp issued his short-lived declaration of war in 1651, there's a good chance the Solonians were busy patching boats, chasing runaway sheep, and wondering why so many ships kept hovering just offshore without doing much of anything. Fast forward to the 1980s, and you'll find that the average Solonian's reaction to the rediscovery of this war was not alarm, nor panic, but a polite variation of, "I'm sorry, what now?" You picture the local pub, the Mermaid Inn perhaps, full of locals sipping pints when Roy Duncan makes his announcement about the treaty. Heads tilt. Someone mutters, "I knew the Dutch didn't send us Christmas cards for a reason." For them, it wasn't a case of ending hostilities so much as discovering they were supposed to have had any in the first place. And therein lies the genius of Silly's unintentional diplomacy. By simply ignoring the war's existence, they achieved a perfect, centuries-long record of peace. No troops deployed, no taxes raised, no morale-boosting anthems written, just an accidental masterclass in passive resistance. One mainstream historical fact that makes this even more endearing is the islanders' long-standing tradition of storytelling. Oral history plays a big part in Solonian culture, and many local tales blend fact, legend, and weather reports with equal weight. It's not surprising that by the late 20th century, some older residents vaguely recalled stories of Dutch ships in the waters centuries earlier, but mostly these were half-remembered tales wrapped in maritime gossip. No one had seriously believed they were still in an active state of war. One fringe theory floated around in local circles after the 1986 treaty suggested that maybe, just maybe, some of the Dutch visitors during the peace ceremony were subtly checking for treasure, hidden centuries ago by pirate couriers in a fog of confusion. Of course, there's no proof of this, but it added spice to an otherwise sleepy news cycle. More plausibly, some local shopkeepers reported an uptick in interest from history enthusiasts and quirky travelers after the peace was signed. One open scholarly debate that tickled a few academic minds post-1986 was the idea of civic awareness in microstates and semi-autonomous regions. If a war is declared on a place with no functioning independent government, and the people there never recognize it, does the war ever truly begin? It's a philosophical pickle, and the silly case became a favored example in legal studies courses looking to challenge students with questions that feel equal parts Monty Python and Machiavelli. But while scholars debated, Solonians continued their routine. For them, the 1986 ceremony was a charming event, a bit of fun to break up the week. Some locals joked they should have held out longer for reparations, perhaps in the form of Gouda cheese shipments or tulip bulbs. Others suggested naming a harbor or a stretch of road after Tromp, though that never quite caught on. Instead, what stuck was a lingering sense of pride, odd, perhaps, but sincere, that their little islands had once been the backdrop of an international anomaly. And they hadn't even spilled a drop of tea. Quirky fact, shortly after the treaty signing, the Scilly Isles Tourism Board updated some of its brochures to include a mention of the newly ended war. It was framed in tones both amused and quietly triumphant, offering visitors a chance to walk through fields that had technically been a battleground in the gentlest war ever recorded. For a time, some souvenir shops sold postcards commemorating the treaty. One featured a cartoon of two men in powdered wigs shaking hands over a map, with a confused sheep in the background. You get the sense that, for the Solonians, history isn't just something that happens to them, it's something they smile through, adapt around, and occasionally frame on a pub wall. Their lack of anger or concern over the situation could teach larger nations a thing or two about how to treat diplomatic oddities, with grace, humor, and perhaps a glass of something bubbly. And it must be said, this was not the first nor the last time the Isles of Scilly found themselves in the margins of history with more curiosity than consequence. Over the centuries, they've hosted shipwrecks, lighthouse innovations, and once even served as a key refueling point for early transatlantic flights. Yet through all that, the war with the Netherlands was the only international conflict they were ever involved in, if involved is even the right word. That makes their record remarkable. No invasions. No revolutions. Just 335 years of mostly fog, farming, and finding humor in forgotten paperwork. As you listen now to the wind curling around corners and your breath softening with each moment, think about this strange fact. In a world full of battles and broken treaties, the Scilly Isles existed in a kind of peaceful glitch, untouched by the thing they were supposedly engaged in. Their landscape stayed the same. Their people carried on. And when the story finally resurfaced, they welcomed it not with rage, but with hospitality, curiosity, and a well-timed grin. So, tonight, as your eyes begin to dim and your thoughts wander toward the sea, remember the Solonians, not as victims, not as warriors, but as quiet masters of the historical shrug. For in their sleepy harbors and flower-filled fields, a lesson whispers softly through the air, that not all wars need to be fought, and sometimes, peace prevails by simply refusing to take the bait. You wake up beneath the gentle weight of history, and as your thoughts drift lazily toward the matter of forgotten wars and salt-washed islands, one simple question floats into view: how on earth does a war last 335 years without anyone remembering it? No parades, no memorials, not even a bad folk song. That kind of forgetting takes talent, or at least a steady supply of miscommunication, misfiling, and mild disinterest. So tonight, you're walking through the soft, dusty corridors of historical forgetfulness, tracing how one of the most unintentionally long-lasting conflicts in the world was gently swept under the collective rug. Let's start with the simple truth: in the 17th century, paperwork was a nightmare. Not because people were lazy, but because everything had to be written by hand, copied by candlelight, stored in increasingly musty archives, and then hopefully remembered by someone who hadn't yet died of gout. In 1651, when Admiral Martin Tromp declared war on the royalist privateers using the Isles of Scilly as their base, it was a tactical gesture. A naval gesture. It wasn't broadcast to the world or declared by shouting town criers in Amsterdam. It was likely entered in some maritime log or passed around naval circles. In the heat of England's Civil War, it barely registered as a footnote. And here's your mainstream historical fact for the night: formal declarations of war in the 17th century didn't always go through parliaments or require immediate notice in newspapers. That's right, wars were sometimes launched by a general or admiral acting under assumed political authority, particularly when time was of the essence. Tromp's declaration was one of those. He believed he was acting in defense of Dutch trade interests, targeting a known nest of royalist troublemakers. But when the parliamentarians regained control of the Isles of Scilly not long after, Tromp's motivation disappeared, yet the paperwork didn't. The Netherlands had changed political forms multiple times since then: Republic, Kingdom, Batavian Republic, then back to Kingdom, and with each change, thousands of pages of policy, correspondence, and treaties were moved, stored, sometimes translated, sometimes ignored. Somewhere in those archives, Tromp's war declaration sat, aging like a forgotten cheese. Meanwhile, in England, and certainly on Scilly, there was no record of it being received or acknowledged. The Isles of Scilly weren't exactly flush with clerks or diplomatic correspondence. If someone from the Dutch fleet had tried to deliver a war notice, they probably would have handed it to a confused fisherman or a sheep. The royalists, who'd originally made the Isles a base, were soon crushed by Cromwell's forces. The parliamentarians took over, and any communication regarding Dutch hostility probably vanished along with the rest of the royalist leadership. And here lies the heart of the fringe detail that kept the war invisible: if one side declares war and the other doesn't know it, does the war even exist in any practical sense? Some historians have joked that the Dutch were at war with a version of the Isles of Scilly that ceased to exist within weeks. Yet the legal wheels, once turned, didn't reverse. In the fog of war, especially in an age without instant communication, the little gears kept spinning long after the operators went home. One of the most open scholarly debates around this concerns continuity of states. Did the successive Dutch governments inherit Tromp's naval declaration of war, or was it voided when the Republic fell? Opinions vary. Some argue that because no formal peace was signed, the technical war status remained, albeit in legal limbo. Others insist it was defunct the moment political leadership changed. But the lack of consensus kept the story buried. For centuries, no one had reason to go looking for it. Meanwhile, history got busy. The 18th and 19th centuries brought war after war: the War of Spanish Succession, Napoleonic conflicts, World War I, World War II. Compared to those, a forgotten scuffle with some rocks off the coast of Cornwall just didn't grab anyone's attention. The only people who might have remembered were maritime archivists, but even they had bigger fish to alphabetize. So it sat there, quietly, until the 1980s. And this is where the accidental charm returns. One man, Roy Duncan, poking through history not because he was chasing drama, but because he was deeply curious. He read about the royalist privateers. He read about the Dutch losses. And then he found it, Tromp's declaration of war. The moment Roy realized there was no follow-up peace treaty, the comedy of the situation likely dawned on him as a grin. He then did what few people think to do: he reached out. The Dutch embassy in London was surprised but cooperative. Their historians did some digging, confirmed Roy's suspicion, and laughed along with him. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't an embarrassment. It was an historical blooper, charming, human, and slightly ridiculous. And in a world where history often leaves us sad or overwhelmed, this little time capsule offered something else entirely: amusement. For the Dutch, the entire situation became a favorite example in diplomatic circles of how important it is to update records. Some legal experts quietly added it to lectures. Scilly, meanwhile, found itself mentioned in articles, documentaries, and trivia books. Not for being a war zone, but for being the most peaceful place that had technically been at war. One quirky fact: a few months after the peace treaty was signed in 1986, a local newspaper jokingly ran a headline that read, "Scilly free at last." It prompted a series of tongue-in-cheek letters from readers who wondered if the Netherlands owed them back wages for 3 centuries of conflict readiness. Another wrote in asking whether Scilly could now join Eurovision. Sadly, no. But the point is this: forgetting the war for 300+ years wasn't laziness. It was just the perfect storm of timing, paperwork, shifting politics, and the fact that no one, on either side, had reason to care. The Dutch had bigger empires to manage. The Solonians had potatoes to dig and boats to repair. And somewhere along the way, both quietly decided to move on without ever really starting. So tonight, as your breathing softens and your thoughts drift outward toward that cool, oceanic silence, picture a file cabinet, deep in a European archive, labeled Active Conflicts. Inside, one slip of paper remains: War with Isles of Scilly, April 1651. And above it, a yellow sticky note: Oops, resolved in 1986. Bring champagne next time.
The Dutch side of the story, from tromp to toasts. Tonight, as your mind floats lazily on calm waters and the quiet creak of imagined sails echoes softly in the distance, we step into the worn wooden shoes of the Dutch, both the salty sailors of the 17th century and the mildly bewildered diplomats of the 20th. Because as much as the Isles of Scilly provide a picturesque and sheep-filled backdrop to this long-running accidental war, the Dutch were the ones who technically fired the first and only paperwork shot. So let's roll back time once again to 1651, to the docks of the Dutch Republic, where Admiral Martin Tromp stood gazing over a fleet that had just returned from yet another exhausting maritime conflict. Tromp, famously confident and fond of decisive action, had already clashed with England before. But in this instance, Tromp wasn't sent to bomb harbors or chase pirates through Caribbean coves. He was sent to deal with royalist privateers operating from the Isles of Scilly, small islands off Cornwall that had, thanks to England's messy civil war, become a rogue royalist base plundering Dutch ships. From the Dutch perspective, this was not only a financial annoyance but a dangerous precedent. If every tiny island could become a home base for piracy, then trade routes, the lifeblood of the Dutch economy, were at risk. That's your mainstream historical fact. By 1650, the Dutch Republic was the world's most powerful naval trading force. They'd built an empire not through land wars, but through spice routes, commercial alliances, and sea power. Every merchant ship that disappeared off the coast of Cornwall wasn't just a few barrels of spices lost. It was a blow to Dutch pride and profit. Tromp, who had already battled royalist-aligned forces elsewhere, decided that enough was enough. And in April 1651 he sailed to the Isles of Scilly and issued a formal declaration of war. Not against England, not against Parliament, but specifically against the Scilly Isles themselves. One has to admire the oddly specific nature of this. You can almost hear the Dutch officers discussing it over pickled herring and maps. We are not at war with England. Just, those bits over there. Tromp's declaration, as far as naval records suggest, was official but not aggressive. He did not launch an invasion. He did not fire a shot. He simply declared war, loitered in the surrounding waters long enough to make his presence known, and then left, presumably satisfied that the message had been delivered. It's here we pause for a beautifully quirky historical footnote. Tromp's fleet may have carried more paper than gunpowder on that particular voyage. He was less a warlord than a stern librarian enforcing overdue notices with a stern glare from offshore. After this, Dutch priorities shifted. The royalists soon lost their grip on the Scilly Isles, and Parliament reclaimed control. The threat to Dutch shipping evaporated. Tromp died not long after in battle, and the Republic turned its attention to bigger fish, literally and politically. Wars with England resumed, but the Scilly Declaration remained oddly unmentioned. Herein lies one open scholarly debate. Some argue that Tromp's act was symbolic, a gesture more about sending a message than actually initiating conflict. Others argue it was legally binding and that the Dutch state, through negligence or oversight, allowed a state of war to continue for centuries. Regardless of intention, it was never reversed. No peace treaty. No diplomatic memo. Just quiet archival dust. And so, from the Dutch side, the conflict entered what one historian called the warm drawer phase. An issue put in a drawer and kept slightly warm by mild embarrassment and bureaucratic inertia. Flash forward to the 1980s, and you have Dutch diplomats pulling that drawer open for the first time in 3 centuries. One can only imagine the chuckles in The Hague when the embassy in London received Roy Duncan's letter. The Dutch are famously polite and efficient, and this revelation didn't prompt alarm, it prompted a gleeful dash through their own records. When they confirmed that the war had indeed never been formally concluded, they reacted not with formality but with charm. That's a particularly Dutch trait, taking odd situations and resolving them with level-headedness and humor. One Dutch official reportedly joked that they were relieved Scilly hadn't seized any Dutch ships during the 300-year conflict. Another quipped that they were glad no back taxes were owed. The embassy agreed to a ceremonial peace signing, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was a delightful excuse for goodwill, soft diplomacy and, of course, champagne. The Dutch ambassador who traveled to Scilly in 1986, Rein Heidekoper, was a perfect fit. Affable, witty, and genuinely interested in history, he approached the ceremony with just the right mix of gravitas and amusement. During the event, he acknowledged the historical oddity with grace, signed the treaty and toasted to eternal peace. In his remarks, he thanked the islanders for their patience and good humor, and you can bet he also made sure the moment was well documented. The Netherlands, after all, has always had a deep respect for official record-keeping, even if, in this case, that same respect had accidentally kept a war on the books for centuries. One curious fact not often mentioned: the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs reportedly used the Scilly story in training materials afterward, as a case study in the importance of revisiting old declarations and ensuring they are fully resolved. It wasn't a rebuke, it was a gentle reminder that even the most peaceful nations sometimes forget to hit the end war button. In the years after the treaty, Dutch media covered the story with a mixture of national pride and wry smiles. Headlines played up the absurdity. Editorials reflected on how this charming footnote reminded the world that diplomacy doesn't always need to involve shouting or swordplay. Sometimes a handshake, a laugh, and a glass of champagne are more than enough. And the Dutch, ever fond of tidy endings, had finally closed the chapter that began with Tromp's sail to Scilly in the age of muskets and candlelight. As you drift now toward dreams, picture that slow passage of time from the deck of Tromp's ship to the sunlit ceremony in St. Mary's Harbor. Picture the generations of Dutch sailors, merchants, diplomats, and historians who lived and died without ever knowing they were technically at war with a peaceful cluster of British islands. And imagine the quiet satisfaction of the modern diplomat who finally, after centuries, could say, "Well then, that's sorted." Because sometimes history's loose ends unravel not with cannon fire, but with a cork popping from a bottle, a smile exchanged across centuries, and the faintest sense that maybe, just maybe, the world could use more stories like this one. A war with no weapons, no battles, no casualties. You lie there, perhaps with a blanket tucked snug around your shoulders, a pillow gently sinking beneath your head, and the hum of history, soft and peculiar, slipping into your thoughts. And tonight, that history invites you to explore something remarkably rare, a war that lasted over 3 centuries without a single weapon drawn, not one battle fought, and not even a stubbed toe to record. We are talking about a war that, for all its longevity, was a conflict in name only, an invisible skirmish held together solely by paperwork and long-term neglect. In a world filled with conflicts that have rewritten maps and shattered cities, how does a war like this manage to exist in such blissful silence? The answer begins, not surprisingly, with misunderstanding. Martin Tromp's 1651 declaration of war against the Isles of Scilly was not a rallying cry to bloodshed but a strategic response to the harassment of Dutch merchant ships by English royalist privateers. The Scilly Isles were, at the time, harboring royalist forces who operated with a mix of stubborn pride and a convenient lack of accountability, treating Dutch cargo vessels like floating invitations to looting. Tromp wasn't declaring war on a people, a place, or a culture. He was issuing a formal notice, a statement of position, meant to justify Dutch naval action and perhaps dissuade further attacks. And yet, the Dutch fleet never fired upon the Scilly Isles. There was no siege, no blockade, no aggressive landing. This was not a war of cannonballs and cries. It was, in a sense, a war of standing awkwardly in someone's front yard, arms crossed, until they stopped being rude. Now, a mainstream historical fact: while wars in the 17th century were indeed bloody affairs, especially in Europe, there were also quite a few conflicts that never really happened on the battlefield. Some were threatened, others merely declared for diplomatic leverage, and many fizzled out before the first musket could be loaded. In that sense, the Dutch Scilly War was not totally unique in its dormancy, but its length and the fact that no one bothered to end it certainly make it stand out. What makes this story so oddly captivating, especially for your sleep-hungry brain, is the stillness of it all. Imagine a war so quiet, birds never stopped nesting, cows continued chewing cud, and not even a bored guard raised an eyebrow. If anything, the war improved tourism in retrospect. Had there been bloodshed, it might have become a dark footnote. But because it remained so wonderfully uneventful, the whole affair sits in the warm folds of historical whimsy. One delightfully quirky fact: in the years following the peace treaty, some silly locals created faux war memorials as jokes, signs pointing to the battlefield, which was really just a sheep meadow, or plaques honoring the brave pigeon who delivered no messages. It was their way of laughing along with history, wrapping themselves in its strange warmth. But perhaps what's most telling is how both sides responded after rediscovering the war. The Dutch didn't file complaints or request damages. Silly didn't ask for apologies or compensation. There was no reckoning, no lawyers, no protests. Just a polite agreement to stop being technically at war. And that, in a way, is the quiet power of forgotten conflicts. With nothing to forgive, no one felt burdened. One open scholarly debate this incident sparked was whether it should even be labeled a war at all. Some argue it was never a war, only a strategic naval declaration that went unnoticed and unacknowledged. Others maintain that the lack of a peace treaty, even symbolic, meant the conflict technically existed in international law. The ambiguity is delicious, especially for those who study the legal frameworks of conflict and diplomacy. But what if, instead of defining it, we appreciated it for what it became? A symbolic tale of patience, the limits of bureaucracy, and the accidental comedy of history left untidied. The war, by most measures, was just a label. A misfiled document. A diplomatic shrug that echoed through generations without ever waking anyone. Imagine the seagulls, blissfully unaware. The children, born and raised on the island, playing tag where war had been declared. The cats, who slept on windowsills while a naval declaration sat in some foreign cabinet, curling in parchment like a forgotten love letter. There were no wounded. No dead. No veterans. No medals. No generals. Only silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes, not of neglect, but of peaceful indifference. And that's something rare and precious. If the purpose of war is to secure peace, then this war may have achieved that aim in the most unconventional way possible, by never happening. And that's a legacy worth considering. Another quirky note: in 1986, when the peace treaty was signed, local school children were reportedly asked to write poems about the war. Some of the entries, later printed in local papers, were adorably absurd, rhyming Dutch with much, and declaring victory by not being touched. One young student even proposed building a peace slide on the beach, because wars should end with fun. Not a bad idea, really. For a war to have no trauma attached to it, no ruins, no stories of sorrow, it becomes almost therapeutic. A lullaby in history's otherwise rowdy tune. Something that reminds us wars don't have to be remembered for horror. They can, very rarely, be remembered for their complete failure to start. So as your body settles and your breathing grows deeper, consider the value of such forgotten, harmless anomalies. They remind us that not all history is written in blood. Some of it is scribbled in pencil and then accidentally dropped behind the sofa. Picture the world leaders of today sitting down to resolve conflicts with a nod and a chuckle. Unlikely, yes. But if Silly and the Dutch could do it, over a span of 3 centuries, perhaps we shouldn't rule anything out. Maybe the secret to peace isn't always treaties and tribunals. Maybe, just maybe, it's a shared sense of whoops. And as your eyelids grow heavier, think of all the birds that have flown over Silly in those 300 years, all the sunsets unbroken by cannon fire, all the sleepy nights where people dreamed without fear, completely unaware that somewhere, technically, they were at war. How the world reacted to the peace treaty. As you breathe in slowly and feel the weight of your day slip further away, imagine the scene not on some quiet harbor this time, but across the scattered corners of the modern world. Offices, classrooms, newsrooms. When the news broke that the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly had finally ended a war they didn't even know was still going on. Yes, tonight we drift gently through the global ripple caused by a 335-year-old clerical oops finally being resolved. And though it never made front-page news next to nuclear treaties or oil embargoes, it made headlines nonetheless, just not the kind with urgency. These were headlines laced with raised eyebrows and knowing smirks. World's longest war ends without a shot, read one. Another cheeky British paper went with, Dutch call it quits, finally. Over in America, late-night talk shows ran segments on it, using exaggerated accents and paper hats. It became a human interest story par excellence, not because of its political importance, but because of its sheer, delightful absurdity. You could almost hear the collective "wait, what?" echoing in newsroom meetings across the globe. One mainstream historical fact to tuck under your pillow tonight is this. Cold War tensions were still simmering in 1986. Gorbachev had just begun perestroika in the Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan was still in office, and the idea of a real nuclear conflict hovered over the global psyche like a storm cloud. So for the world to suddenly hear that a 17th-century war had been officially ended with a glass of champagne and a handshake on a sheep-filled island, it felt like a cosmic sigh of relief. Even if symbolic, even if silly, it was a rare dose of historical comfort. It reminded people that not all international entanglements needed to end with red lines and barbed wire. Some could end with laughter. Now let's take a quirky detour to Japan. Yes, even Japan. A small but passionate community of amateur historians there picked up the silly story and began adding it to trivia nights and radio shows. One Tokyo-based podcast even aired a dramatized reenactment of the war, featuring sound effects of sheep bleeding during the siege. Was it historically accurate? Not in the slightest. Was it glorious? Absolutely. This, right here, is your quirky fact for the evening. A Japanese souvenir shop, known for its obsession with niche European history, briefly sold keychains that read, "I survived the Dutch Silly War, 1651 to 1986. The product sold out in weeks. In Canada, college debate teams picked it up as a case study for procedural logic in international law. A few professors began working the Silly War into their lectures on treaties, non-aggression pacts, and forgotten declarations. Some even compared it to other absurd declarations, like when Liechtenstein once accidentally invaded Switzerland with a group of lost soldiers during a military exercise, only to be invited in for tea. This brings us to an open scholarly debate that started circulating among political scientists and legal theorists in the wake of the silly story going viral. If two regions are at war, but do not act on it, is there any psychological impact, historical weight, or political residue left behind? In other words, does an ignored war still matter? Some argue that every unresolved war, no matter how dormant, casts a kind of legal or moral shadow. Others insist that wars like this one are simply vestigial organs of outdated diplomatic machinery, interesting but irrelevant. What everyone agreed on, however, was that the silly Dutch War was a teachable moment. It showed that not everything in international relations had to be heavy. That formality and symbolism could still exist without trauma. That a forgotten file, once rediscovered, could turn into a story of charm rather than regret. Back in the UK, school teachers had a field day with it. The story quickly entered history curricula as a fun anecdote to liven up the otherwise dense chapters on 17th-century politics. Children were asked to draw what they thought the war looked like. Some drew ships firing baguettes. Others imagined the Dutch arriving with bicycles and cheese platters. A class in Leeds created a mock battle reenactment using papier-mâché helmets and foam noodles. The BBC ran a short documentary, and it became one of those beloved clips they replayed on rainy Sunday afternoons, the kind of documentary you fall asleep to on a full stomach, smiling softly. And perhaps that's why the story stuck. It wasn't dramatic or harrowing. It didn't ask for justice or reparations. It asked for a chuckle and, perhaps, a toast to human oversight. In the Netherlands, a few newspapers treated the signing with equal measures of formality and fun. There was quiet pride that Dutch diplomacy had, in the end, handled the situation so gracefully. The Dutch ambassador Rein Heidkoper was praised for his wit and warmth, and a Dutch university held a mock debriefing, where students presented theories on how the war could have escalated. One presentation featured a fictional naval confrontation resolved by a pancake-eating contest. Meanwhile, Silly's tourism gently swelled. The story drew travelers who loved quirky histories, who came for the beaches but stayed for the idea that they were walking through what was once, technically, a war zone. A few pubs added peace ale to their menus. One gave out wooden tokens commemorating the treaty's signing, and local guides wove the story into their walking tours with relish. And here's something beautifully human. As the story spread, letters started pouring into the Silly Isles. From America. From Canada. From South Africa. From schoolchildren in Malaysia and retirees in Argentina. People wrote to say thank you, for the story, for the smiles, for proving that some conflicts don't need to escalate. That not all history has to be hard to hear. That peace can be accidental, even funny. These letters are still kept in folders by local historians. Some are displayed in the tiny Silly Museum, written in all languages, all styles, some with hand-drawn cartoons. If you could hold them all at once, they'd probably weigh as much as the original war declaration. Heavier even, and infinitely kinder. So tonight, as your breath slows and the world outside dims into quiet shadows, remember that history doesn't always echo with cannon fire. Sometimes it sighs with relief. Sometimes it chuckles at itself. Sometimes, it gets forgotten long enough to become oddly beautiful. Think of the headlines, the reenactments, the souvenirs, and the strange shared smile that spanned centuries and continents. Think of a world that paused, just for a moment, to laugh at the notion that two peaceful places had ever been enemies. And as you settle deeper, remember this: even the dullest files in the oldest drawers can hide stories that make the world a little warmer. The treaty ceremony, champagne, sheep, and shrugs. It's a gentle spring day in 1986, and you're standing, hypothetically, of course, on St. Mary's, the largest of the Isles of Scilly, where the sea glints like a wink from history itself. You can almost feel the light breeze fluttering the edges of the official documents as Dutch Ambassador Reinhard Kupper leans over a simple wooden table to sign a treaty that has taken 335 years to reach the surface. The mood is not tense. No one is clutching at pearls or pacing nervously. There are no snipers on the roofs, no motorcades lined up in defense formations. In fact, the most prominent security concern at the event is a sheep who keeps wandering too close to the catering table. Welcome to the peace ceremony between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly, an event more charming than critical, more symbolic than necessary, but entirely worth celebrating. The actual setting is picturesque. The signing took place outdoors, under a relatively cloudless sky, in view of Scilly's rolling green fields and centuries-old stone cottages. Local council chairman Roy Duncan, the same amateur historian who had resurrected the story, plays host to this odd but delightful diplomatic moment. And there's your mainstream historical fact. The Scilly-Dutch Treaty of 1986 is officially recognized as one of the longest gaps between a declaration of war and its corresponding peace agreement in recorded history. The Guinness Book of Records even took interest at the time, verifying the timeline and adding the war to its pages under the category of most prolonged conflict without casualties. But don't let that formality distract you from the warm absurdity of the scene. There are school children in uniforms gathered off to the side, some holding little paper Dutch flags they made in class. The locals are smiling, not out of nationalism, but out of sheer amusement. For them, this is a once-in-a-lifetime occasion, the kind of story you tell your grandchildren and the kind of event that gets replayed again and again at community centers every time someone asks, "What's the weirdest thing that ever happened here?" There's no pomp, really, just friendliness. The ambassador, dressed smartly but not overly stiff, gives a short speech. He acknowledges the long span of history that led them here, pokes gentle fun at the oddity of it all, and thanks the people of Scilly for their hospitality. His tone is light, warm, and appreciative. No one pretends that this is a major geopolitical event, and that's precisely why it's so lovable. That brings us to the quirky fact for tonight. The champagne served at the ceremony wasn't just symbolic, it had been donated by a Dutch merchant who read about the event in a newspaper and thought, well, if we're going to end a war, we might as well toast properly. The corks popped without fanfare, and glasses were passed around. There were toasts, naturally, some serious, some ridiculous. One local toasted to another 300 years of peace, and another quipped that they'd now expect Dutch Christmas cards without fail. You can almost hear the laughter, gentle and communal, rolling across the field like a soft wave. The sheep, by the way, did eventually get into the food. No one stopped it. This was not the sort of affair where people worried about strict decorum. It was a celebration of the human side of history. The side that forgets things, rediscovers them, and decides, without stress or posturing, to make things right again. One open scholarly debate that emerged after this ceremony was whether symbolic treaties like this one hold any real legal value. Some international law experts argued that, since the conflict had essentially ended through neglect, the treaty served no practical purpose other than narrative closure. Others countered that symbolic diplomacy has intrinsic value, that it strengthens cultural memory, reinforces peaceful norms, and offers gentle lessons to future generations about how even forgotten stories deserve tidy endings. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But what's not debated is how thoroughly the ceremony captured public imagination. Newspapers ran photos of the signing, showing Duncan and Heidkapper laughing together like old friends. The story made its way into books, trivia shows, and even inspired amateur dramatizations in various corners of the UK and the Netherlands. For a few brief weeks, everyone seemed to be talking about the war that never was, and the treaty that finally ended it. Even Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands was reportedly amused when informed of the situation. Though she didn't attend the signing, because, let's be honest, this was a bit below royal scheduling. She sent a polite note of recognition that added just the right amount of formality to balance the event's cozy tone. Later, the original signed treaty was framed and placed in a modest exhibit in the Isles of Scilly Museum, a small building filled with local artifacts, maritime relics, and now, one of the strangest peace accords ever penned. Visitors often chuckle when they read the inscription, expecting a joke, only to find out that yes, this actually happened. Yes, this is real. And yes, the war really lasted 335 years because no one remembered to end it. As your breathing grows softer and your body sinks further into relaxation, picture the treaty resting there behind glass. The ink has faded slightly, the paper just barely curled at the edges, but the signature is clear. It marks the official end of a war that caused no harm, drew no blood, and gave the world one of the most whimsical reminders that history doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers, giggles, and sighs its way to a close. And as the ceremony wound down, with the last glasses of champagne drained and the children ushered back to their classes, the ambassador reportedly looked out over the fields, nodded once, and said, "Well, that's that." No fanfare. No lingering tension. Just a small punctuation mark at the end of a centuries-long run-on sentence. It was the most delightfully anticlimactic war in human history, and its conclusion was just as gently underwhelming as everything that came before. And so, as your thoughts begin to float downward like dandelion seeds on a breeze, you might find yourself oddly comforted by this chapter of history. A story where no one lost. Where the only battles were against time and bureaucracy. Where the ending wasn't epic, but simply kind. And maybe, just maybe, that's the best kind of ending there is. The legal quirks, how a war was technically real. You close your eyes and drift gently now, letting your thoughts wander not to battlefields or catapults, but to law books. Wait, don't panic, it's not that kind of law. This isn't the land of harsh courtrooms and endless objections. This is the sleepy, cobwebbed corner of international law where forgotten wars hide in footnotes and historical oddities take the stand. Tonight we wade through one of the most fascinating parts of this tale, how a war that was never fought, never felt, and never feared was somehow still, technically, real. The Dutch war against the Isles of Scilly may have been quiet enough for seagulls to outshout it, but in the realm of legal doctrine, silence can be deafening. The moment Admiral Tromp declared war in 1651, the situation entered a legal category all its own, an undeclared but effective hostilities clause that straddled the line between formal war and diplomatic scowl. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. International law didn't fully define war in the modern sense until the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. Before then, much of what constituted war was based on precedent, custom, and who remembered to write things down. That meant any declaration, even a poorly documented naval grumble, could be binding in the absence of a formal peace. Tromp, acting under the authority of the Dutch Republic, had declared hostilities against a specific territory, however temporarily or symbolically, and that act carried weight in 17th-century diplomatic terms. Even if the conflict ceased to matter, its legal roots remained buried in the ever-expanding garden of old European treaties, waiting for someone like Roy Duncan to stumble over them centuries later. And stumble he did, setting off a delightful series of shrugs and nods that eventually led to the 1986 peace signing. But legally? It was a bit of a rabbit hole. One quirk of international law that plays heavily here is the principle of continuity of the state. That's the idea that when governments change, say when a republic becomes a kingdom or a monarchy becomes a democracy, the state itself still exists in a legal sense. Which means, when the Dutch Republic declared war and then morphed into various political forms over the centuries, the state of war technically persisted unless explicitly revoked. This is why the Netherlands' modern government was in a position to sign a peace treaty. The war had survived political revolutions, shifting alliances, and multiple rebrandings of government, like a forgotten app running silently in the background for 3 centuries. One open scholarly debate centers on whether the lack of hostilities nullified the war. Some argue that if a state neither acts on a declaration nor reminds anyone that it happened, the war effectively dissolves like sugar in tea. Others maintain that unless peace is declared, the war simply exists, suspended in a kind of legal deep freeze. The Dutch, to their credit, never acted upon the declaration after the initial episode in 1651. But since no peace treaty was issued, the legal mechanism remained theoretically valid, like a very old light bulb that never got switched off. And then there's the question of Scilly itself. In 1651, the Isles were under royalist control, briefly operating as a semi-independent military outpost during England's Civil War. The Dutch targeted them specifically, rather than the broader English nation. But what happened when Cromwell's parliamentarians recaptured the Isles shortly afterward? Did that void the declaration? Did the change in sovereignty erase the diplomatic act? Historians can't agree. Some say the original declaration became void once the royalist cause collapsed. Others argue that since the declaration was territorial, not strictly political, the war remained in effect regardless of who controlled the land. It's all so wonderfully fuzzy, like trying to settle a bar tab when the bar burned down 2 centuries ago and the only witness is a pigeon. Here's your quirky fact for the night. In 1986, just after the treaty was signed, a few legal scholars at the University of Leiden held a mock court to try the validity of the war. They took roles as Dutch diplomats, British naval commanders, and even sheep farmers. After several hours of lively discussion and more than one bottle of wine, the mock court ruled the war the most amicably pointless conflict in European history. The decision, sadly, holds no legal sway, but it does appear in a journal footnote that law students still occasionally reference with delight. There's also the issue of recognized belligerency. For a war to be official, it typically needs to be acknowledged by at least one external party. In this case, not a single other nation commented on or acknowledged the Dutch declaration at the time. That might mean the war never truly existed in diplomatic eyes. But here's where it gets sticky. If both parties accept the reality of a past war, even retroactively, does that give it legitimacy? In 1986, the Netherlands and Scilly both signed the peace treaty not as a joke, but as a formal gesture. And according to most interpretations of international law, when two states recognize a conflict and resolve it with mutual consent, that's enough to retroactively legitimize it. So yes, by signing that treaty, the war was finally real in every possible sense. It was born, it was forgotten, it was rediscovered, and then, at long last, it was ended. Think of it like this. You find an old bill from a bakery you went to 300 years ago. You never paid it. The bakery never asked. No one remembered. Then one day someone knocks on your door and says, "We've reviewed our accounts and it appears you owe us 1 bread roll." You both laugh, pay the bill with interest, maybe even eat another roll together, and decide that history is better when it ends with a snack. In many ways, that's exactly what the Dutch-Scilly conflict became. A forgotten line item, rediscovered not with bitterness, but with curiosity and good humor. And once it was addressed, it wasn't dismissed, it was honored, signed, and toasted. And so, as your breath eases out, long and slow, imagine the tiny ink marks that changed everything. The initial declaration, scratched into a maritime ledger by a weary admiral. The rediscovery, typed on a clunky 1980s typewriter by an amateur historian. And the peace treaty, signed with a fountain pen and a chuckle, on a breezy island dotted with grazing sheep and blinking seagulls. You might even imagine the war itself, not as a force of destruction, but as a polite guest who overstayed their welcome, finally bowing and excusing themselves from the party. And that's the beauty of it. A legal oddity, a bureaucratic ghost, finally laid to rest with dignity and champagne. No lawsuits. No apologies. Just mutual understanding and the realization that even forgotten paperwork deserves a proper farewell. What if the war had actually happened? Tonight, as you melt further into stillness, your head cushioned by dreams not yet dreamt, let's tiptoe into the strangest corner of this already peculiar tale, the realm of the hypothetical. What if the war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly hadn't been forgotten? What if, against all historical logic and bureaucratic apathy, someone had decided to escalate it? Let's imagine a world where Admiral Trump's declaration wasn't just an archival curiosity but the prelude to real action. Close your eyes, figuratively or literally, we won't judge, and picture Dutch ships lined up off the coast of the Isles of Scilly. The winds are brisk. The sails are taut. Officers bark orders in crisp 17th century Dutch. Seagulls shriek. And in the distance, sheep. So many sheep. Our fictional battle begins not with gunpowder, but with confusion. The Scilly Isles, home to fewer than 3,000 people even today, were hardly a fortress. The royalist defenders stationed there in 1651 were exhausted, low on morale, and likely more focused on scavenging supplies than preparing for a naval onslaught. A real Dutch attack, had it occurred, would have overwhelmed them in hours. There would have been no drawn-out siege, no last stand. Just a swift occupation by extremely polite foreigners asking, "Where should we put our cannons?" That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. The Dutch Navy in the mid-17th century was the largest and most advanced maritime force in the world. At their peak, they controlled more ships than England, France, and Spain combined. Their merchant fleets crisscrossed the globe, their admirals were legends, and their shipbuilding prowess was unmatched. If Trump had wanted to flatten the Isles of Scilly, he could have done so with little more than an annoyed nod. But let's indulge the scenario further. Suppose the Dutch had taken the Isles and occupied them for, say, a decade. What would have changed? Well, first off, we might today refer to Scilly as a formerly Dutch territory, and history books would list it alongside colonial outposts in the East Indies and the Caribbean. There might be Dutch-style houses on the coastlines, a windmill or two inland, and a peculiar tradition of placing pickled herring in children's shoes on December 5th. We might even be speaking of Cylinder Dutch Creole, a made-up language blending Cornish English and 17th-century merchant slang. But it gets quirkier. What if the locals didn't mind? What if the occupation was oddly pleasant? Imagine Dutch soldiers politely tending gardens, introducing stroopwafels to the local bakeries, and installing canal-like irrigation systems to water Scilly's famously abundant flowers. The region might have turned into a strange cultural hybrid, a West European Bermuda, lost in a fog of maritime gentility. Here's your quirky fact for the evening. During another completely unrelated historical incident in the 1800s, a Dutch ship really did get stranded on the Cornish coast, and the sailors who washed ashore were welcomed with bread, beer, and temporary jobs mending fishing nets. Apparently, even accidental visitors from the Netherlands were treated like long-lost cousins. The open scholarly debate that comes into focus with this hypothetical is one often asked by counterfactual historians: how much of history is determined by action, and how much by inaction? If Trump had acted instead of posturing, the story would have been entirely different, possibly bloodier, certainly more serious. But because he didn't, because no one followed through, the event slid into myth. Which is more powerful, the war that happened, or the war that could have? For military historians, it's a frustrating question. There are no casualty reports to analyze, no strategic documents to dissect, no maps redrawn with the usual red ink of conquest. But for philosophers and storytellers? It's a goldmine. It reminds us that history is not just what occurred, but what almost occurred. The Scilly War wasn't an event. It was a possibility that never became reality, a line of dominoes never tipped. That might be why it feels more dreamlike than historical, like a bedtime story someone started telling but forgot to finish. Now drift further into the imagination. What if the war had been remembered and revived, not by force, but by farce? Say, sometime in the 1800s, a bored Dutch diplomat uncovers the original declaration and decides to reactivate it as a prank. He sends a polite letter to Scilly demanding unconditional surrender and a crate of clotted cream. The locals, unfazed, reply by inviting the Dutch for a cream tea and a cricket match. A delegation arrives by steamer, wearing historical uniforms, and they all spend the weekend sharing folk songs and pretending to be at war, with wooden muskets and exaggerated accents. From then on, every summer, the war is reenacted, not with reenactors, but with the actual descendants of the parties involved. The Dutch bring cheese. The Scillonians bring cider. Everyone brings sunscreen. Would it still be a war? Probably not. But it would be an international tradition unlike any other. Think of it as the world's most polite annual invasion. There's something oddly comforting about that idea, a war remembered not for its violence, but for its lack thereof. A war that became a vacation. A war turned village fair. A reminder that not all declarations need destruction to be noticed. That sometimes, forgetting to fight is the best strategy of all. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the real version of this story, the one with no shots fired, no borders redrawn, and no enemies made, resonates so deeply. In a world saturated with conflict, the Scilly Dutch War stands as a monument to restraint. It's the equivalent of walking away from an argument before it starts. Of deciding that paperwork is enough. Of realizing that some things, once declared, don't actually have to be done. So as your thoughts grow more drowsy and the edges of this story blur into soft fog, hold on to that image, a war that chose not to happen. A conflict frozen by common sense. A declaration left unanswered, like a letter with no return address. Because in the end, perhaps the most powerful thing about this 335-year standoff is not what it threatened, but what it didn't become. It's not a story of heroes or villains. It's a story of almosts. And sometimes, that's all we need to fall gently, peacefully, into sleep. The Isles of Scilly, geography of an accidental battlefield. As you lie there now, the day behind you and the softness of night wrapped around your thoughts, let's visit the land at the very heart of this long, sleepy war. You're not going to some blasted landscape or fortified citadel. No, tonight we float gently toward a small green archipelago nestled off the southwestern tip of England, serene, isolated, and endlessly charming. The Isles of Scilly, which once found themselves at the center of a 335-year technical war, are perhaps the most unassuming war zone history has ever known. These islands weren't selected by Admiral Tromp because they were strategically brilliant, nor because they posed a fearsome threat to the Dutch Navy. They were chosen because, in 1651, they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. At the tail end of the English Civil War, as Cromwell's parliamentarians clashed with royalist holdouts, the Scilly Isles became a makeshift stronghold for those loyal to King Charles. This allowed English royalist privateers, essentially legalized pirates, to harass Dutch merchant ships in the surrounding waters. Tromp's war declaration, aimed at this tiny cluster of islands, was less about conquest and more about sending a very formal version of "cut it out." So let's explore this curious little archipelago and its accidental role in global affairs. The Isles of Scilly are made up of about 140 islands, islets, and rocky outcrops, though only 5 of them are inhabited. St. Mary's is the largest and most populous, home to Hugh Town, the administrative hub if you can call anything with fewer than 2,000 residents a hub. The other inhabited islands, Tresco, St. Martin's, St. Agnes, and Briar, are even smaller, each with their own sleepy charm. Picture narrow lanes lined with stone cottages, beaches that wrap around the land like whispers, and flower fields swaying under Atlantic breezes. It's hard to imagine these places as war targets. Harder still to believe they were ever part of an international dispute. But they were. And here's your mainstream historical fact for the night. The Isles of Scilly have played minor but recurring roles throughout British naval history, not just during the Civil War. Their location near major maritime trade routes has made them useful as lookout posts, ship repair stops, and unfortunately, shipwreck hotspots. In fact, one of Britain's worst maritime disasters, the sinking of HMS Association in 1707, occurred near these waters due to poor navigation, prompting advancements in sea cartography and the eventual invention of the marine chronometer. So yes, the islands may be small, but their waters once reshaped the course of naval science. Now for something more quirky. One of Scilly's most beloved legends involves a pub on St. Agnes Island where, for centuries, the locals claimed they could hear ghostly Dutch sea shanties on stormy nights, an echo of the never-fought war. Of course, this was likely the result of strong wind and stronger ale, but it added a playful eeriness to the island's historical reputation. Some even dressed as Dutch sailors during village festivals, waving foam cutlasses and handing out mock surrender leaflets to tourists. The war, rather than being feared, became a kind of inside joke shared by islanders and history buffs alike. But let's look deeper. What made the Isles of Scilly even viable as a royalist hideout in 1651? Geography. The islands are far enough from mainland England to serve as a refuge but close enough to be supplied by boat. Their rocky coastlines made them difficult to assault without detailed charts, and their fog-prone weather gave them an added layer of defense. To the Dutch, who were more interested in protecting their trade routes than capturing real estate, the islands were more a nuisance than a prize. That's why no attack ever happened. The risk outweighed the reward. But what if someone had decided differently? What if the Isles had been taken? There's an open scholarly debate on how history might have unfolded if the Dutch had actually launched a campaign to occupy the Scilly Isles. Some historians argue that it could have triggered a diplomatic crisis between the Netherlands and the emerging English Commonwealth, perhaps even dragging in France or Spain depending on how the conflict evolved. Others suggest it would have been quickly resolved with a treaty, perhaps one signed on an old wooden ship in the Channel, with neither side especially interested in fighting over rocks and sheep. Either way, the islands remained untouched, and their fame now rests on what didn't happen rather than what did. Today, the people of Scilly live quiet lives, fishing, farming, running goose houses for summer tourists. The echoes of the war are only visible in stories, plaques, and the occasional newspaper piece that resurfaces whenever someone decides to look up longest war in history. Local schoolchildren are taught about the treaty, not with dread or shame but with pride. They understand they live on a historical anomaly, a place that was technically at war for centuries without ever firing a shot or digging a trench. That's quite a legacy for a chain of islands most people couldn't place on a map. There's something magical about that. As you listen to the imaginary sea breeze rustling through seagrass and hear the far-off bleat of a Selonian sheep, you begin to realize that this place wasn't merely the passive recipient of a diplomatic blunder. It was a perfect symbol, small, overlooked, and peacefully persistent. The kind of place history tiptoes around rather than stomps through. And in its own quiet way, the Isles of Scilly teach us something. They teach us that not all wars need fanfare, not all treaties need gold seals, and not all conflicts need winners and losers. Some can just float, unbothered, through time, until someone finally says, "Oh right, we should probably do something about that." So tonight, as you drift further into that delicious weightlessness before sleep, picture the map of the Isles of Scilly, scattered like breadcrumbs off the Cornish coast, kissed by centuries of ocean wind, and forever linked to a war that chose to never quite arrive. They are history's best example of peace by forgetfulness, of diplomacy by default, of serenity that outlasted saber-rattling by simply ignoring it. And maybe that's the kind of story worth carrying into your dreams. Tromp the reluctant warrior, man behind the declaration. Let your body relax now, every muscle unwinding as if history itself is smoothing the bedsheets. As your thoughts become lighter, we turn our gaze toward the Dutch admiral who, through one brief act, unknowingly launched the longest conflict in history. That man was Martin Harputsoen Tromp, a naval commander of immense prestige, the sort of figure usually carved in stone and remembered with flinty seriousness. But tonight, we're not studying his tactical brilliance in major sea battles. No, tonight we're looking at Tromp the reluctant warrior, the man who declared war on the Isles of Scilly in a move so fleeting, so bureaucratically thin, that even he might have forgotten about it by the time he docked at home. Tromp, at the time of the Scilly incident in 1651, was already one of the Netherlands' most trusted naval leaders. His record included bold victories against the Spanish and growing tensions with the English. The Dutch Republic relied heavily on maritime trade, and Tromp's job was not only to keep the fleet sharp but also to protect the commercial lifeblood of a nation growing wealthier by the week. That's your mainstream historical fact for the evening. During the 17th century, the Dutch were the dominant naval force in the world, and Tromp's leadership was instrumental in securing that position. He pioneered new ship formations, commanded respect from sailors and officers alike, and turned the Dutch Navy into a force feared across Europe. And yet, in the case of the Isles of Scilly, this formidable commander found himself acting out what must have felt like a scene from a stage comedy. Here's how it went. Dutch merchant vessels were being attacked by English royalist privateers operating out of the Scilly Isles, those tiny specks in the Atlantic that barely appeared on continental maps. The royalists had retreated there as the English Civil War wound down, desperate for resources and taking whatever ships they could get their hands on. Tromp, tasked with defending trade, couldn't allow these attacks to go unanswered. But England itself was a diplomatic minefield at the time. The Dutch were reluctant to provoke Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarians by launching an attack against the mainland or engaging too directly in the messy aftermath of civil war. So what did Tromp do? He narrowed the conflict. He declared war not on England, but on the Scilly Isles, a royalist-controlled nuisance, separate enough to be targeted without antagonizing the broader English state. In diplomatic terms, it was a masterstroke of restraint, punish the aggressors without burning bridges with potential allies. In practical terms, it was like sending a sternly worded email to a dozing intern and then forgetting to hit send. Here's your quirky fact for the evening. The war declaration itself was so underwhelming, so lightly handled, that no written copy of it has survived. No treaty was filed in The Hague, no ship's log recorded the moment in dramatic fashion. It was probably verbal, shouted or mumbled between a few officers, maybe scribbled into a captain's logbook that's since been used to light someone's fireplace. Some historians believe Tromp didn't even expect it to be taken seriously, that it was a gesture more than a threat, intended to make a point and little else. But gestures have a way of sticking, especially when no one officially wipes them away. Tromp's war, brief as it was in his mind, would echo through centuries simply because no one thought to end it. It's a reminder of how history is often made not by bold strokes, but by overlooked scribbles. Tromp would go on to fight in the First Anglo-Dutch War soon after, a brutal and very real conflict that consumed his attention. He died in battle in 1653 during the Battle of Scheveningen, struck down by a sniper, his legacy already sealed in Dutch history. He never knew his quiet Scilly declaration would become his most enduring footnote. And that opens a scholarly debate that drifts gently through the minds of naval historians. Should we even count the Scilly conflict as one of Tromp's wars? Some argue that without written proof or military action, it doesn't belong in the same category as his other campaigns. Others counter that intent, no matter how briefly held, is enough to warrant a place in the historical record. After all, it was his command, his authority, and his strategic decision that began it. Even if the war was waged entirely in the realm of technicality, it was still his technicality. If you wandered into a naval museum in the Netherlands today, you'd find portraits of Tromp surrounded by cannons, stormy seas, and triumphant banners. You'd read of great battles with ships torn to splinters and enemies routed with sharp maneuvers. But somewhere, Tucked away on a dusty plaque or buried in an academic paper, you might find a line, just one line, about the Scilly War. It reads almost like a joke. Declared war on Isles of Scilly. No known shots fired. War forgotten. And yet, that's the one moment that still gets chuckles centuries later. That's the one piece of his legacy that has become bedtime story material. As your eyes begin to feel heavier and your mind floats like a little sloop across calm waters, think about how even the most powerful figures in history leave behind strange footprints. Trump, despite commanding vast fleets and shaping the destiny of empires, is also remembered for the war that wasn't. For a declaration that went unanswered. For a storm that never arrived. Maybe that's a comforting thought. That even in an age of cannon fire and smoke-choked battles, someone could declare war, change their mind, and move on. That a forgotten moment could eventually bring people together in laughter, ceremony, and a shared sense of how silly and human history can be. Perhaps that's Trump's real legacy. Not just the battles he fought, but the war he didn't. The forgotten paperwork, how wars slipped through cracks. As you settle more deeply into the embrace of your bed, your blankets tucked just so and the hum of the room softly echoing around you like the creak of an old wooden dock, let's quietly drift into the bureaucratic side of this centuries-long accidental war. Now wait, don't wrinkle your nose. Tonight's tale of forgotten paperwork is far more than dusty scrolls and dry signatures. This is the story of how history, when left in the hands of tired clerks and overstuffed cabinets, can drift into a kind of absurd immortality. The war between the Dutch and the Isles of Scilly, as we've seen, was real in its declaration and real in its legal standing. But it was also a paper war, a phantom conflict that survived not through cannon fire, but through oversight, laziness, and a curious lack of cancellation notices. You might think wars end with peace treaties, trumpet fanfares, or royal declarations. But sometimes they just don't end. They wait in the margins, slumbering in manila folders and forgotten ledgers, until someone pokes them awake. And that's your mainstream historical fact tonight. Many old wars, especially those involving smaller territories or shifting alliances, went decades or even centuries before being formally ended. The War of the Spanish Succession? Technically unresolved between Great Britain and Andorra until the 20th century. The Russo-Japanese dispute over the Kuril Islands? Still ongoing depending on whom you ask. These aren't epic tales of strategy and sacrifice. They're footnotes. Paperwork. Blinks in the administrative machine that governs nations. What makes the Scilly Dutch situation so endearingly odd is how thoroughly it was forgotten. Not just by the public but by the governments involved. No one remembered to cancel the war. Not one document, not one desk officer in the Dutch Republic or later the Netherlands thought to say, "Hey, do we still have an outstanding war with those tiny islands near Cornwall?" It's like finding out you're still subscribed to a Fruit of the Month club that hasn't shipped anything since 1689 but keeps quietly billing your ancestors' ghost. So how did it survive so long? That's where the bureaucracy comes in. In 17th century Europe, declarations of war weren't always filed with rigid consistency. You might have formal declarations announced by heralds in city squares, or letters signed by monarchs and delivered by horseback. But other times, especially when dealing with semi-autonomous regions like Scilly, it was more informal. Maybe even verbal, as some suspect was the case with Trump's declaration. That alone makes it fragile. Without clear documentation, nobody knows who's supposed to end it. And if the paperwork isn't filed properly, or worse, if the original clerk misfiles it under Scilly Isles instead of Scilly Isles, you're looking at 3 centuries of bureaucratic snoozing. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In the mid-20th century, before Roy Duncan uncovered the Scilly Dutch conflict, a British Ministry of Defense archivist reportedly stumbled across a vague mention of the Scilly War in an unrelated ledger. Thinking it was a joke or perhaps a typo, the archivist scribbled in the margins, "Check later." Sounds fishy. That margin note was later found and is now framed in the Isles of Scilly Museum. Even the rediscovery of the war came from paperwork. Duncan, a local historian with a love of footnotes and dusty pages, unearthed the story by sifting through naval records and Dutch correspondence. He wasn't sent on a mission by a government or guided by an old general's memoirs. He was just curious. One of those rare people who actually reads the appendices and wonders what's missing from the index. That leads us gently into tonight's open scholarly debate. Does a war that is never acted upon still require formal closure? Some legal historians argue no. The absence of hostilities, troop movement, or political engagement should count as an informal end. They see the 1986 treaty as symbolic pageantry rather than necessity. Others argue the opposite, that because war is a legal condition between states, only a formal reversal, an actual treaty, can end it. Otherwise, you leave open the possibility, however ridiculous, of future claims, reparations, or misunderstandings. And there's precedent to support both views. After World War I, several countries took years to formally end their involvement with the Central Powers. Costa Rica, for example, didn't declare peace with Germany until the 1940s. What? Bureaucracy. Sometimes the war ends in spirit but not in ink. And that's what makes the silly Dutch situation so charmingly cautionary. It reminds us that while wars are often sparked by pride and power, they can also be kept alive by inertia and misfiling. It's the most human of errors. And it turns history from a tale of empires into a story of someone forgetting to check a box. Let your mind wander now to a dusty office in The Hague. Picture a wooden desk, creaky drawers, stacks of yellowed papers tied with twine. A sleepy clerk leans back in a wobbly chair, staring at a smudged document from 1651. War with where? He mutters, blinking. Still open? That can't be right. He yawns, stretches, and scribbles a note to follow up. Maybe next week. But next week never comes. Decades pass. Empires rise and fall. The desk is replaced, the building renovated. But somewhere in the archives that note remains, buried under layers of forgotten intentions. Until one day someone named Roy Duncan pulls a dusty book off a shelf, flips to a chapter nobody's read in generations and frowns thoughtfully. Wait a second. And just like that, a 335-year-old clerical error becomes an international curiosity. Not a scandal. Not a tragedy. Just a laugh, a treaty, and a toast. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? To know that sometimes, peace isn't forged in blood or thunder, but in the gentle sound of a page turning. That sometimes the world forgets to fight, and in doing so, preserves a kind of accidental tranquility. So as your breath slows, your muscles melt, and your thoughts become the soft shadows of sleep, remember, the greatest peace ever declared may have been the one no one remembered to end, until they finally did, with paperwork, champagne, and absolutely no sense of urgency. The 1986 Treaty, a toast to nothing. You're sinking into stillness now, the quiet cradling your mind like a gently bobbing boat on calm waters, and it's here, in the drowsy space between historical curiosity and midnight serenity, that we finally arrive at the moment the world remembered the war. Not because of an invasion. Not because of any urgent peace summit. But because someone stumbled over the fact that a 335-year-old conflict had never technically been wrapped up. Tonight, we float gently into the sleepy year of 1986, when a treaty was signed not out of necessity, but out of charming embarrassment. Picture it, the modern Netherlands, a prosperous European democracy with a well-functioning government, busy managing real international affairs, trade agreements, and Cold War diplomatic tightropes. And somewhere in a quiet corner of that machine, someone received a letter from the Isles of Scilly. The letter came from Roy Duncan, the Isles' local historian and council chairman, who had been poking around old documents like a cat in a forgotten attic. He had found something odd, a reference to a war declared by the Dutch on the Isles of Scilly that had never been formally ended. At first, it was a delightful quirk. He chuckled. Then he kept digging. And the more he researched, the clearer it became, no peace treaty had ever been signed. The war, officially, still existed. You can almost hear him saying, perhaps over a scone and a mug of tea, well then, let's sort that out. So Roy Duncan, in all earnestness, contacted the Dutch embassy in London. And here's your mainstream historical fact for this section. The Dutch government, upon receiving the inquiry, took it seriously. Not gravely serious, but seriously enough to look into it, verify the facts, and respond. They confirmed that yes, there had been a declaration of war. No, there had been no formal conclusion. And yes, they would be delighted to officially end hostilities, assuming, of course, that no one on the Isles of Scilly still harbored hard feelings from the 1600s. Thus began one of the most wholesome diplomatic episodes in modern history. No troops were deployed. No borders were redrawn. No treaties were leaked to the press in a blaze of controversy. Instead, Dutch Ambassador Reinhard Kupper traveled to the Isles of Scilly to meet with local leaders and ceremoniously sign a peace treaty. The event was small, polite, and deeply funny. The ambassador arrived with the poise of someone delivering a formal apology for having left a garden gate open in the 17th century. He was met by islanders who, though amused, were genuinely proud to be involved in such a delightful footnote to history. The treaty was signed in the council chamber of the Isles of Scilly, a room better known for budget meetings and village planning discussions. As hands were shaken and documents exchanged, everyone present knew they were doing something special, not consequential in the traditional sense, but meaningful in its own curious way. Here's your quirky fact of the night. After the treaty signing, there was indeed a toast. Champagne was poured, speeches were made, and laughter rippled through the room as the ambassador officially declared, "The war is over." Some attendees wore historical costumes. Others brought homemade Dutch treats. It was a peace treaty that felt like a village fair, complete with friendliness, fanfare, and no trace of acrimony. The ambassador later said it was one of the most enjoyable diplomatic acts of his career. What makes this moment so remarkable is not just the humor, but the intention. In a world often obsessed with grand gestures and hardened political positions, the Treaty of 1986 was a gentle reminder that peace doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes, it can be warm, relaxed, and sealed with a chuckle. There's an open scholarly debate about whether the treaty was legally necessary. Some argue it was a harmless symbolic gesture. After all, neither side had shown any aggression in over 3 centuries. Others maintain that, from a legal standpoint, it was essential. The declaration of war had been legitimate, however brief and however absurd its consequences. Therefore, a formal peace was the only way to truly close the chapter. Even if no one was ready to restart hostilities over it, it mattered on principle. And for the people of Scilly, it mattered in spirit. 4 decades afterward, the story of the 335-year war that ended with a handshake and a toast became a source of pride. The Isles of Scilly, too often forgotten on maps, were now famous for something no one else could claim. The Guinness Book of World Records took notice. Tourists began asking about the war, and locals responded with practiced ease, weaving tales of declarations, treaties, and peace that arrived not with fanfare, but with friendship. Imagine, now, the scene from the outside. The wind tousling the ambassador's coat as he steps off a small ferry, islanders waiting with flags and baked goods. Somewhere nearby, sheep bleat lazily. Children giggle as they pretend to surrender with makeshift white flags crafted from napkins. No soldiers. No drums. Just the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the rustle of history being gently put to bed. That's what this treaty was, a bedtime story come full circle. The kind that ends not with a bang, but with a sigh of amusement. And as your mind wanders toward its own final chapter for the night, you might reflect on how rare it is to see such closure. So many historical tensions remain frayed, so many disputes unresolved. But here, in a small corner of the Atlantic, 2 sides remembered a forgotten moment and chose to bring it to a peaceful, joyful end. They chose to acknowledge history not with guilt or regret, but with lightness and grace. And maybe that's what makes this tale linger in the imagination more than most real wars ever do. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. Because in a world too full of conflict, the idea that one war could end with a smile, a sip, and a perfectly timed photo op is not only unusual, it's a kind of magic. So sleep easy now, knowing that somewhere in a council archive on a sleepy island, a peace treaty rests quietly in a folder, never likely to be disturbed. It's proof that even forgotten wars deserve a soft landing. And sometimes, the best history is the one that leaves no scars, only stories. Media frenzy and the world's most polite war. Now that you're fully relaxed, your limbs loose and heavy like ropes floating just beneath the surface of the sea, let's glide into the part of the story that turned this forgotten footnote into a viral sensation long before viral meant anything digital. Because after centuries of nobody caring, the world suddenly cared, a lot. What had once been an obscure diplomatic fluke became a favorite feature on radio programs, newspaper columns, trivia nights, and eventually the internet. The war that never happened somehow managed to be the most talked about war of its kind. And all it took was one treaty and a few chuckling journalists with a flair for headlines. It all began in 1986, right after the signing of the peace treaty between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly. At first it was local news, an amusing oddity for Cornish papers and Dutch regional outlets. But word spread quickly. Something about the sheer absurdity of it, 335 years of war without a single casualty, struck a chord. It was as if history itself had told a long-forgotten joke and was now leaning back, waiting for the world to laugh. And laugh it did. Reporters loved it. The BBC ran stories. Dutch radio hosts made jokes about battle-hardened sheep and amphibious cheese raids. American newspapers picked it up too, delighting in the headline-friendly nature of the situation. World's longest war ends with a toast. Forgotten war finally gets a finish. Dutch declare peace, Scilly forgives. These weren't hard news stories. They were palate cleansers, refreshing in an era increasingly overwhelmed by real conflict and political tension. That's your mainstream historical fact. In the late 1980s, Global media was saturated with stories about the Cold War, nuclear arms negotiations, regional wars, and tense diplomatic standoffs. Against that backdrop, a centuries-old conflict ending peacefully offered exactly the kind of charming relief editors were desperate for. The silly Dutch piece became a bedtime story for grown-ups, tucked between pages of more sobering news. And it didn't stop there. It kept echoing, resurfacing every few years, particularly when people needed something light to balance heavier headlines. Every anniversary of the treaty, someone would bring it up. Every time a trivia show needed a guaranteed laugh or a pub quiz reached the history round, the silly war was there, ready with its odd charm. By the 1990s, it had even made its way into school curricula. Sometimes as a fun historical fact, other times as a teachable moment on the importance of documentation and diplomacy. And here's your quirky fact for the night. In 1997, a British game show mistakenly listed the silly Dutch war as the shortest war in history. A viewer wrote in to correct them, noting with pride that it was, in fact, the longest. The show apologized publicly. The viewer was from silly. And this touches on an open scholarly debate. How seriously should we take this story? Some academics argue that framing it as a war is misleading. Without military action, casualties, or even political engagement, can it really be called a war at all? Isn't it more like an unfinished chapter, like someone writing chapter 1 and never continuing? Others argue that's exactly the point. By traditional definitions, perhaps it fails. But in the realm of legal history and international relations, it absolutely qualifies. There was a declaration. There was no peace treaty. Therefore, the war existed, even if it sat quietly like a dozing cat for 3 centuries. Definitions matter less than the reality that both sides eventually agreed to end it. The signing of the treaty created a historical event from the absence of one. It was a masterclass in how history isn't just about battles and rulers, but about memory, recognition, and closure. And that's what captured the public imagination. Because really, how often does the world get to celebrate something ending not in fire or fear, but in mild confusion and warm laughter? The idea that we could all just forget to fight? That struck a deep chord. In the years since, the silly war has inspired documentaries, radio dramas, even comedic plays. Tourists to the Isles now ask for war tours, expecting battlefields and relics, only to be shown beaches, gardens, and perhaps a framed photo of the treaty ceremony. Local tour guides lean into the humor, describing the siege of the village pub and the invasion of friendly Dutch pastries. The story has become part of the island's identity. And while the Netherlands has moved on with a knowing smile, the people of Scilly have embraced it like a quirky cousin who shows up late to every party but always brings good stories. You can even buy postcards featuring imaginary battle maps and souvenir mugs that say, "I survived the 335-year war, just barely." There's something deeply comforting about this. In a world of unresolved tensions and ancient grudges, to know that a war could be remembered this way, without pain, without bitterness, just a silly little tale to pass down, is oddly healing. It's not that the story is meaningless. On the contrary, its meaning is profound in its simplicity. Not all declarations need battles. Not all wars need blood. Some can just wait patiently in the background until someone remembers to bring cake and call it off. And now, as your eyes grow heavier and your thoughts start to stretch like long shadows across cobbled streets, picture a modern-day Scilly Islander standing at the harbor, waving at a passing Dutch ferry. They're not thinking of war. They're thinking of dinner. Maybe they'll have fish. Maybe they'll have something Dutch. But either way, they'll raise a glass, not to victory but to peace that came without trauma. To a story that proved history doesn't always need drama to be memorable. As sleep comes in, imagine your dreams floating across those quiet waters, drifting past lighthouses and sleepy cottages, through laughter and gentle waves. You are not entering a battlefield. You're entering the softest kind of war story, the kind where the only thing that ever exploded was a champagne cork. Lessons in international forgetfulness. The air around you is hushed now, as if the world itself has leaned in to listen, and your thoughts hover like fog above still waters. It's in this perfect quiet that we explore one of the most curious aspects of the 335-year war, the fact that no one remembered it. Not the British. Not the Dutch. Not even the islands supposedly at war. It wasn't a conspiracy or a cover-up. It was a bureaucratic shrug, a centuries-long lapse in memory shared by generations. And that forgetfulness, as silly as it may seem, offers some surprisingly meaningful lessons about how the world works, or doesn't work, sometimes. The tale of the Dutch Scilly War is unusual, yes, but it's also a revealing mirror. It reflects how large institutions, Kingdoms, empires, republics, can become so tangled in their own paperwork, politics, and passing centuries that they misplace entire wars. It shows how easily the tides of time can wash over the minor affairs of states, eroding them into punchlines or folklore. And it reminds us that just because something is declared, recorded, or feared at one moment in history doesn't mean it will remain that way forever, especially if no one checks the filing cabinet. Your mainstream historical fact for tonight is this: many wars, even serious ones, have ended in informal or unclear ways. The American Civil War? Several Confederate units continued guerrilla resistance for months after Appomattox. The Korean War? Technically still ongoing, with only an armistice, not a peace treaty, in place since 1953. The Dutch Silly War simply takes that ambiguity and stretches it out like a ball of yarn in the sun. But the Dutch and the Solonians weren't unique in their forgetfulness. Even world powers have forgotten to wrap things up. Spain and the Netherlands technically remained at war for 12 years after the 80 Years' War was supposed to end, simply because Spain hadn't gotten around to ratifying the treaty on their side. And here's your quirky fact for this section. In 1972, the British and Icelandic governments nearly forgot that they had declared a limited cod war over fishing rights. A confused ambassador from Iceland attended a London event expecting to sign a treaty, only to discover the British thought the matter had already been resolved. The dinner still happened. The treaty was signed. And both sides agreed that maybe they should write these things down more clearly in the future. So what does it mean when entire wars are forgotten? What does it say about memory, not just personal memory, but national and institutional memory? There's an open scholarly debate here, one that philosophers, historians, and political theorists continue to circle. Some argue that forgetting is dangerous, that it allows injustices, aggressions, or unresolved wounds to go unacknowledged. They point to cases like colonial legacies, indigenous land disputes, or post-conflict reconciliation efforts that suffer because no one officially closed the chapter. But others see a softer side to historical forgetfulness. They argue that letting go, failing to obsessively document every feud and grudge, might actually be a natural way to keep peace. If no one remembered to continue the fight, maybe that's a form of resolution in itself. The Dutch Silly War becomes, then, a symbolic case study. Was the lack of violence due to apathy, or wisdom? Did they forget because it didn't matter, or because they quietly agreed, in their own way, that peace was preferable? The story also raises a question about human nature that you might ponder as sleep draws closer. How many personal conflicts in your own life have persisted simply because no one said enough? How many minor arguments, slights, or misunderstandings linger, not out of true disagreement, but because nobody remembered to wave a little white flag and move on? History, after all, is just the grand version of everyday human patterns. The Dutch Silly conflict was born of strategic necessity, wrapped in diplomatic awkwardness, and preserved in administrative neglect. But its long silence, the 335 years of nothing, might be the most instructive part of all. It teaches us that time can erode even the sharpest declarations, that a forgotten war can be more powerful as a story than it ever would have been as a battle. There's something oddly poetic about that. And while the Dutch certainly weren't losing sleep over the war by the 1800s, the same might not be true for local historians and trivia lovers today. Since the treaty's signing in 1986, countless articles and university lectures have been inspired by it, not to mention school projects, tourist brochures, and a dozen tongue-in-cheek reenactments. The war that was never fought has become a model of quirky diplomacy, a classroom example of how international law, memory, and culture often operate on different timelines. Here's a soft image for you as your eyes grow heavier. Picture a lone archivist in the early 20th century, buried in the stacks of the Dutch National Archives, stumbling across a vague reference to a conflict involving the Isles of Scilly. He squints, rubs his temples, scribbles a note on the margin of a ledger, and moves on. Somewhere, that note gathers dust for decades until someone, somewhere else, breathes new life into it with curiosity and a few polite letters. And all of a sudden, peace blooms where no battle ever happened. You might ask, could this sort of thing still happen today? Could two nations, tangled in modern bureaucracy and electronic records, forget a conflict in the same way? Possibly. But less likely. Digital record keeping, social media, and 24-hour news cycles make it harder for anything to slip into obscurity for long. The Dutch Silly War may be the last of its kind, a time capsule of slower governments, handwritten treaties, and an era when news traveled at the pace of a ship in good weather. In that way, it's not just a funny story, it's a relic of a different kind of world. One where forgetting was easier, where time moved gently, and where someone could accidentally leave a war running like a forgotten kitchen tap. And as your consciousness begins to dim, and your breath softens into the steady rhythm of night, take comfort in this: not all unfinished business must end in conflict. Some things can be resolved with a smile, a sip of champagne, and the simple act of remembering what was once overlooked. The Scilly Isles? Misunderstandings, maps, and mistaken identity. You're almost completely weightless now, drifting through the soft stillness of night like an old ship sailing beneath a sky full of stars, and as we gently push forward into tonight's tale, we reach a section that would make even the most serious historians crack a grin: the confusions and misinterpretations that added layers of absurdity to the already eccentric war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly. Because when you're dealing with a place so small, so obscure, and so oddly named, things are bound to get tangled up in the world's collective memory. The Isles of Scilly, pronounced silly, yes, just like the word, already sound like they were invented by a comedy writer. They're not imaginary though. They're a real archipelago off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, home to roughly 2,000 people, a few puffins, and of course an entire forgotten war. But for centuries the very name of the Isles caused problems. Letters were misrouted, records were mismarked, and even today more than a few people assume Scilly is just a typo. Which leads us to your mainstream historical fact. In 17th century Europe, the spelling and naming of places were often inconsistent, even on official maps. The name Scilly appeared in various forms including Sealy, Sicily, and in one delightful Dutch naval record from 1652, simply Zilly. You can imagine the frustration of mapmakers trying to match phonetics to parchment while dodging the salty sea air and working with unreliable compasses. That uncertainty about the name contributed to a lasting confusion. For years, some people believed the Dutch had actually declared war on Sicily, the much larger Mediterranean island, instead of the sleepy Isles of Scilly. And here's your quirky fact. In a Dutch schoolbook printed in 1934, a short blurb about the war mentions an island off the Italian coast. Yes, Sicily. The confusion was so widespread that some Dutch historians, well into the 20th century, considered the whole affair an apocryphal legend, a sort of sea story told by drunken sailors rather than a verifiable event. It took deep archival digging by amateur historians to piece together enough clues to confirm the war's real target. That's right, this internationally recognized war was nearly scrubbed from memory, not by political conspiracy but by a geographical typo. That alone is enough to make any cartographer weep softly into their compass. But even once the target was clear, the war's legacy continued to morph through misunderstanding. There's an open scholarly debate that stems directly from this. Do names and labels matter more than the events themselves in shaping memory? If the Isles of Scilly had been called something like Stonehaven or Southwest Rocks, would the story of this war have gained such popularity? Many argue no. The name Scilly, which is, let's be honest, hilariously close to silly, gives the tale a natural levity that made it irresistible to media outlets and trivia fans. It invites wordplay, lends itself to cartoons, and softens what might otherwise be a rather dry tale of maritime technicalities. Others argue that the name is incidental, that it's the oddity of a war without a shot, a peace without a fight, that gives the tale its legs. But few can deny that the Dutch declare peace with the Scilly Isles just rolls off the tongue like a well-aged joke. Even government agencies weren't immune to the name mix-up. In 1979, a Dutch maritime registry mistakenly filed a navigation route under Scilly, Spain, prompting a brief investigation into how a British territory had apparently floated 1,000 miles south overnight. The error was eventually corrected, but only after an archivist wondered aloud if the Scilly Isles were a myth, perhaps an island mentioned in Moby Dick. They're real of course, and they're proud of their history. Walk through Hugh Town, the main settlement on the Isles of Scilly, and you'll see plaques and gift shops referencing the war. Tour guides recount it with theatrical glee, sometimes bringing along props, flags, antique documents, even replica Dutch coins, to spice up the story. The locals, it seems, have leaned into the joke, but with a kind of respectful affection. They're not laughing at history. They're laughing with it. Imagine the pride of being from one of the only places on Earth that can say, without exaggeration, we were technically at war for over 300 years, and we still had time for tea. It's become part of the local mythology, a way to explain the Isles' curious place in the world. Not powerful, not infamous, but quietly legendary. That's a special kind of fame. And even now, after all the treaties and newspaper features and Wikipedia entries, some people still think the story is made up. When tourists first hear of the 335-year war, many assume it's a prank. No shots fired? No casualties? That doesn't sound like a war. And that's precisely the charm. It's a story that challenges the definition of war. A story that flips our assumptions. A story that makes us smile in the same breath as we reflect. And so, as the stars blink gently overhead in your imagination, and the sea laps calmly at the edges of your drifting thoughts, consider how names, simple, ordinary names, can change the course of memory. If the Isles had been named differently, would Trump's declaration have been buried forever? Would anyone have bothered to sign that treaty in 1986? Or would the whole tale have been lost in the waves of history, just another missing footnote swallowed by the tide? Maybe, just maybe, it's the silliest names that survive the longest. They're harder to forget. They linger. And sometimes they turn a minor clerical oversight into one of the most beloved historical anecdotes of all time. So sleep now with that image in your mind, a dusty old map, edges curled, ink fading, but one name still visible through it all. Silly. Silly, strange, and perfectly unforgettable.